13-year-old smiled during trial for killing grandparents. Then, the judge made history. 13-year-old Evan Rowe sat in the courtroom with a smile that chilled everyone around him. It wasn't the smile of a scared kid. It was slow, steady, and far too calm for someone facing charges this serious. As the prosecutor described what happened to his grandparents, Evan didn't flinch. He only watched, almost pleased, tapping his fingers on the table like he was keeping time to some quiet tune. He believed nothing could touch him because he was young, but he had no idea the judge was about to make history. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began, before the courtroom, before the cameras, before a boy became the youngest person in state history to face such consequences. It started in a quiet suburban home where two retired teachers had built their lives around second chances. Helen and Martin Rowe were known throughout their neighborhood as the couple who never gave up on anyone. They had opened their door to Evan 3 years earlier, believing that love and structure could reshape a troubled child. Their friends warned them. School counselors begged them to seek help, but Helen would always say the same thing: "He's just misunderstood." On a Thursday evening in late autumn, that belief would cost them everything. The courtroom on that Monday morning was packed beyond capacity. Every wooden bench groaned under the weight of spectators who had arrived before dawn to witness something unprecedented. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras ready, notebooks open. Victim advocates sat with tissues clutched in trembling hands. And at the center of it all, flanked by 2 deputies and his exhausted defense attorney, sat Evan Rowe. He wore a button-down shirt that was too big for his thin frame, his dark hair combed neatly to one side. He looked like he should have been in a classroom learning algebra, not sitting in a courtroom answering for the deliberate ending of 2 lives. But the moment Judge Richard Marlowe entered and the bailiff called for order, Evan did something that sent a wave of disbelief rippling through every witness in that room. He smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't the confused expression of a child overwhelmed by circumstance. It was a deliberate, almost amused grin that spread slowly across his face as the charges were read aloud. First-degree intentional harm resulting in death. 2 counts. The victims were Helen Marie Rowe, age 67, and Martin James Rowe, age 70, his grandparents, the people who had taken him in when no one else would. The prosecutor's voice was steady and professional as she outlined the brutality of what had happened in that quiet home. But Evan seemed utterly unbothered. He traced invisible shapes on the defense table with his index finger. He shifted in his seat like a student bored during a lecture. At one point he leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, and several people in the gallery swore they heard him chuckle. Judge Marlowe was a man known for his composure. In 23 years on the bench, he had presided over some of the most disturbing cases the county had ever seen. But even he paused when he looked down at Evan and saw that expression. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. He asked Evan a direct question. Did he understand the charges being brought against him? Did he comprehend the severity of what he was accused of doing? The courtroom held its breath. Evan stopped tracing shapes. He looked up at the judge with those wide, dark eyes that should have held fear or confusion or remorse. Instead, he tilted his head to the side like a curious animal and said, just loud enough for the microphones to catch, "Better than you do." His attorney's face went pale. A gasp echoed from the gallery. One of the victim advocates stood up and had to be gently escorted outside. The prosecutor seized the moment. She approached the bench with a tablet in her hands and informed the court that the evidence against Evan Rowe was not circumstantial. It was overwhelming. There was a fingerprint recovered from a shattered picture frame found beside Helen's body. There was security footage from a neighbor's camera that captured movement in the yard during the exact time window when the harm occurred. There were deleted messages recovered from Evan's personal device that painted a chilling picture of intent. And there was something else, she said, her voice dropping to a tone that made even the seasoned reporters lean forward. There was a video, a recording that Evan himself had made just hours before his grandparents were found. She didn't play it yet. She simply let the weight of that statement settle over the room like a heavy fog. Evan's smile faltered for just a second. It was barely noticeable, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. Judge Marlowe saw it. The prosecutor saw it. And in that moment, the energy in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't going to be a case about a troubled child who made a terrible mistake. This was going to be about accountability, about whether the law could look beyond age and see intention. Judge Marlowe straightened in his chair and addressed Evan directly. His voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of decades spent seeking truth. He said, "Young man, the law sees more than just how many years you've lived. It sees what you intended to do, and it sees what you did." Evan's grin returned, wider than before, as if the judge had just issued a challenge he was eager to accept. The defense attorney stood and made a valiant attempt to reframe the narrative. She spoke about Evan's difficult upbringing, his father's early passing, his mother's struggles with stability. She painted a picture of a child who had been passed between relatives who had never known consistency or safety. She argued that whatever had happened in that house was the result of trauma, of a young mind that hadn't yet developed the capacity for full moral reasoning. Her voice was passionate, almost pleading. But as she spoke, Evan sat beside her with that same detached expression, occasionally glancing at the clock on the wall as if counting down the minutes until he could leave. It was a performance that undermined every word his attorney said, and the prosecutor knew it. By the time the morning session ended, the battle lines were drawn. The prosecution would argue that Evan Rowe had planned, executed, and attempted to cover up a double-taking of life with a level of calculation that defied his age. The defense would argue that he was a child, that his brain was still developing, that the system owed him a chance at rehabilitation. But beneath all the legal language and procedural motions, one question lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Could someone so young truly understand the permanence of what they had done? Or had Evan Rowe looked his grandparents in the eyes and chosen their fate with full awareness? The answer would come not from theories or arguments, but from the evidence itself. And that evidence was about to tell a story more disturbing than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. As the judge called for a recess, Evan stood slowly, turned to face the gallery, and for just a moment locked eyes with his aunt. She was the only family member who had come. And as tears streamed down her face, Evan's expression didn't change at all. Helen and Martin Rowe had spent their entire adult lives believing in the power of transformation. They met in college, both studying education, both driven by the conviction that every person deserved patience and understanding. After graduation, they married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends and former students. They bought a modest two-story home on Maple Street, a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles in lazy circles and neighbors knew each other by name. The house had creaky wooden floors that announced every footstep, a wraparound porch with a swing that swayed in the breeze, and a garden in the back where Helen grew tomatoes and roses. It was the kind of place that felt lived in, loved, and safe. For 40 years, that home was a refuge not just for Helen and Martin, but for anyone who needed it. Martin taught high school history for 34 years. He was known for staying late to help struggling students, for organizing after-school tutoring sessions, for believing that every teenager had potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Helen taught elementary school, specializing in children with behavioral challenges. She had a gift for reaching kids that others had given up on. Parents would request her class specifically because they knew she wouldn't quit on their child. Even after retirement, the couple remained active in their community. They volunteered at the local soup kitchen every Saturday morning. They organized book drives for underfunded schools. They opened their home to family members who needed a place to stay while getting back on their feet. Their daughter, Caroline, often joked that her parents collected strays, both human and animal. The joke was loving, but it was also true. When Caroline's life began to unravel, Helen and Martin stepped in without hesitation. She had struggled for years with instability, moving from job to job, relationship to relationship, unable to find solid ground. Her son, Evan, bore the weight of that chaos. His father had passed away when Evan was 7, and the loss seemed to hollow something out inside the boy. Carolyn tried her best, but her best wasn't enough. There were missed school days, forgotten meals, nights when Evan was left alone while his mother worked double shifts, or disappeared into her own struggles. When Evan was 10, Caroline made the hardest decision of her life. She called her parents and asked if they would take him. Just for a little while, she said. Just until she could get stable. Helen and Martin didn't hesitate. They converted the upstairs guest room into a bedroom for their grandson, painting the walls blue, buying new sheets and a desk for homework. At first, Evan seemed like any other child adjusting to a new environment. He was quiet, a bit withdrawn, but Helen attributed that to the upheaval in his life. Martin worked with him on homework every evening, patiently explaining concepts until Evan understood. Helen made his favorite meals and read to him before bed, even though he was probably too old for it. They enrolled him in the local middle school and attended every parent-teacher conference. They believed that structure and love would be enough. But as months turned into years, small concerns began to surface. Evan's teachers reported that he had trouble connecting with other students. He didn't seem to understand social boundaries. There were incidents, pushing another child off the playground equipment, making threats that were dismissed as jokes, an unsettling fascination with violent video games and movies. The most troubling reports came from neighbors. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 doors down, mentioned that her cat had gone missing and was later found injured in a nearby alley. She couldn't prove anything, but she had seen Evan watching the animal with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Mr. Chen, who lived across the street, found evidence that someone had been setting small fires in his backyard. Again, no proof, but Evan had been seen in the area. Helen and Martin dismissed these concerns as misunderstandings or coincidences. Their grandson was struggling, yes, but he wasn't dangerous. He just needed more time, more patience, more love. They ignored the school counselor who gently suggested that Evan might benefit from professional evaluation. They turned down offers to connect with child psychologists who specialized in behavioral issues. They believed they could handle it themselves. But in the final weeks before that terrible Thursday night, even Helen began to waver. She confided in Martin late one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, that something felt different. Evan had stopped engaging with them almost entirely. He would sit at the dinner table in complete silence, eating mechanically, staring at nothing. When they tried to talk to him, his responses were cold and clipped. Helen had walked past his bedroom door one night and heard him whispering to himself, strange fragments of sentences that didn't make sense. Martin found drawings in Evan's notebook, dark sketches of broken clocks and stick figures lying motionless. They told themselves it was just teenage angst, just the artistic expression of a troubled mind working through trauma. But doubt had begun to creep in. Helen even recorded a voicemail to Caroline that she never sent, her voice shaking as she said, "We need to talk about Evan. It's getting worse. I don't know what to do anymore." The community that had known and loved Helen and Martin for decades would later recall seeing changes in the couple during those final weeks. They seemed more tired, more withdrawn. Helen stopped attending her weekly book club. Martin declined an invitation to help coach a youth baseball team. A neighbor asked if everything was okay, and Helen forced a smile and said they were just dealing with some family challenges. She didn't elaborate. She didn't ask for help. She held on to the belief that had guided her entire life. that love and patience could fix anything. On the Wednesday before the Thursday that changed everything, Helen ran into a former colleague at the grocery store. They chatted about retirement, about grandchildren, about the changing seasons. As they said goodbye, Helen paused and said something that would haunt her friend forever. She said, "Sometimes I feel like he's watching us. Even when he's not in the room, I can feel his eyes." Her friend laughed it off as grandparent paranoia, but Helen's expression didn't change. She wasn't joking. Thursday began like any other day. Martin woke early and made coffee. Helen prepared breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, the same meal she'd made 1,000 times. Evan came downstairs without speaking, ate quickly, and retreated back to his room. The day passed in quiet routine. Martin worked in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming hedges. Helen caught up on laundry and paid bills. Evan stayed in his room with the door closed, the faint sound of music or videos drifting into the hallway. By evening, the sun had set and the house settled into its familiar rhythms. Dinner plates were washed and put away. Helen sat in the living room with a book. Martin watched the evening news, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Upstairs, Evan paced back and forth, the old floorboards creaking with each step. And somewhere in that quiet, ordinary evening, a clock began ticking down toward something irreversible. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, and 7 minutes later, the house on Maple Street went completely silent. The Thursday evening air was cool and still, the kind of autumn night where the world seemed to hold its breath. Streetlights flickered on automatically as darkness settled over Maple Street. Inside the row home, the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, each tick marking time in a house that had witnessed decades of ordinary life. Martin adjusted the volume on the television as a commercial break began. Helen turned a page in her novel, a mystery she'd been trying to finish for weeks. Upstairs, Evan's door remained closed, but the pacing had stopped. The silence that replaced it should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the pause before a storm breaks. At approximately 9:58, Martin stood and stretched, announcing he was going to check on something in his office. He had a small room at the end of the upstairs hallway where he kept financial records, family documents, and a collection of historical books he'd accumulated over his teaching career. The door was always locked, not out of secrecy, but simply because the room contained important papers, and he preferred to keep it organized. Helen heard his footsteps on the stairs, the familiar creak of the 7th step that had never been fixed despite years of intention. She heard him reach the landing and move down the hallway. Then she heard something else. Voices. Muffled at first, then rising in volume. Martin's tone was firm, the way it used to sound when he was correcting a student. Evan's voice was higher, defensive, cutting through his grandfather's words. The argument lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was intense enough that Mrs. Patterson next door later reported hearing raised voices through her open bedroom window. She couldn't make out the words, just the cadence of conflict. Martin had caught Evan trying to force open the office door. Later investigation would reveal fresh scratches around the lock mechanism, evidence of someone attempting to pick it or pry it open. When Martin confronted him, Evan offered no explanation, no apology. He simply stared at his grandfather with an expression that made the older man take a step backward. Martin ordered Evan back to his room. There was a moment of tense silence, and then the sound of a door slamming. Martin stood in the hallway for a long moment, his hand pressed against the office door as if protecting what was inside. Then he took a deep breath and returned downstairs. Helen looked up from her book as Martin entered the living room. She asked if everything was all right. Martin hesitated, then said they needed to talk about Evan tomorrow. Really talk. He suggested they might need to call Caroline and discuss more serious interventions. Helen nodded slowly, worry etched across her features. They agreed to sleep on it and make a plan in the morning. Martin returned to his chair and tried to focus on the news, but his mind was elsewhere. Helen set her book aside and moved to the kitchen to prepare tea, a nighttime ritual that always helped her relax. The kettle whistled softly. She poured hot water over chamomile leaves and carried 2 cups back to the living room. It was 10:12 when she handed Martin his tea. It would be the last ordinary gesture of their lives. The exact sequence of what happened in the next 7 minutes would be reconstructed later through forensic evidence, blood spatter analysis, and the cold logic of physics. But in the moment, it unfolded with terrible speed. Evan emerged from his room silently, his footsteps careful and deliberate. He moved down the stairs with the confidence of someone who had planned each step. In the living room, the brass candlestick that normally sat on the mantelpiece was missing. It was an antique, heavy and ornate, a wedding gift that Helen had polished weekly for 40 years. Evan had taken it earlier, hidden it in his room, waiting for the right moment. He gripped it now with both hands as he descended. Martin never saw it coming. He was lifting his teacup when Evan appeared behind him. The first strike came from above, swift and brutal, connecting with the back of Martin's head with a sound that Helen would later describe in her final moments as impossibly loud. Martin dropped forward, the teacup shattering on the hardwood floor, hot liquid spreading across the boards. He tried to rise, tried to turn, his hands grasping at the armrests of his chair. But Evan struck again and again, each blow delivered with a force that seemed impossible from someone so young. Martin collapsed fully, his body sliding from the chair onto the floor. His glasses fell from his face and skidded under the coffee table. Blood began to pool beneath him, dark and spreading. Helen screamed. It was a sound of pure horror, a noise that came from somewhere primal and desperate. She dropped her own teacup and stumbled backward, away from the sight of her husband lying motionless. She ran toward the hallway, perhaps intending to reach the front door, perhaps trying to get to the phone in the kitchen. But Evan was faster. He moved with purpose, cutting off her path, backing her into the narrow hallway between the living room and the stairs. She begged him. Witnesses in neighboring homes would later report hearing a woman's voice pleading, though the words were indistinct. She asked him why. She asked him to stop. She promised they could get him help. But Evan's expression never changed. He raised the candlestick again. Helen tried to shield herself with her arms. The force of the first blow knocked her sideways into the wall where a framed photograph hung, a picture of Evan as a baby, smiling in Helen's arms. The frame shattered as Helen's weight crashed against it, glass fragments raining down. Her hand reached out instinctively, trying to catch herself, and her palm pressed against the broken frame, leaving a smeared print in her own blood. She slid down the wall, her legs giving out, her breath coming in gasps. Evan stood over her, and in her final moments, Helen looked up at her grandson and saw nothing she recognized. No anger, no fear, no regret. Just a cold, distant focus, as if he were completing a task he'd been assigned. The candlestick came down twice more. Then the house fell into a silence deeper than any it had known before. For several minutes, Evan stood perfectly still in the hallway, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The candlestick was still in his hands, now slick and heavy. He looked at his grandparents, Martin visible through the doorway to the living room, Helen crumpled at his feet, and felt nothing but relief. It was over. The rules were gone. The voices telling him what to do, when to sleep, how to behave, all of it silenced. He set the candlestick down carefully on the hallway table, as if returning it to its proper place. Then he noticed his clothes. There were spatters of red on his sleeves, small drops on his shoes. He frowned slightly, annoyed at the complication. He needed to clean up. He needed to think. The back door was unlocked, leading out to the garden and the small shed where Martin kept tools and supplies. Evan moved through the kitchen, turned on the outdoor light, and stepped into the cool night air. And somewhere in the darkness, a neighbor's security camera silently recorded everything. The first 911 call came at 10:43. Mrs. Patterson's voice shook as she reported hearing terrible sounds from the row house, followed by an eerie silence that felt wrong. She told the dispatcher she'd heard what might have been screaming, then nothing at all. She said the lights were still on inside, but no one was moving past the windows. The dispatcher asked if she'd seen anything suspicious. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then said something that would echo through the case file for months to come. She said there was a boy sitting on the front porch swing, just sitting there in the dark, not crying, not panicking, just staring straight ahead at nothing. The dispatcher sent 2 patrol units immediately. Deputies Morrison and Keller arrived at 10:51. Their dash cam footage captured the scene exactly as Mrs. Patterson had described it. The house glowed with warm light from every window, looking peaceful and inviting from the outside. But on the porch, barely visible in the shadows, sat Evan Rowe. He was moving the swing gently back and forth with his feet, the chains creaking softly. As the deputies approached with flashlights raised, Evan looked up at them with an expression of mild curiosity. Deputy Morrison called out, asking if he was all right, asking if his grandparents were home. Evan's response made both officers exchange a glance. He said, calm as still water, "They're sleeping. You should be quiet so you don't wake them." His voice held no fear, no confusion, no urgency, just a polite request, as if he were hosting guests who'd arrived too late in the evening. Deputy Keller moved closer, his hand resting instinctively on his radio. He noticed immediately that Evan's clothes were mostly clean, button-down shirt still tucked in, jeans without any obvious stains. But there was something on his left sleeve, a small smear, dark and damp, catching the light. Keller asked Evan to stand up slowly and keep his hands visible. Evan complied without resistance, even offering a small smile as he rose from the swing. Morrison approached the front door and knocked firmly, calling out for Helen and Martin. No response. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and called out again, his voice echoing through the entryway. Still nothing. The moment Morrison stepped inside and his flashlight swept across the hallway, his entire body went rigid. He keyed his radio with a voice that had gone flat and professional, the tone officers use when they need to stay functional despite what they're seeing. He requested immediate backup, medical response, and a supervisor. Then he added 3 words that brought the full weight of the county's resources: possible double fatality. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed into a chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices. Ambulances arrived even though it was already clear no medical intervention could help. Crime scene investigators pulled up in unmarked vehicles, already pulling on gloves and booties. A perimeter was established, yellow tape stretched across the yard. Neighbors emerged from their homes, clustering in small groups on the sidewalk, whispering and craning their necks to see. And through it all, Evan remained on the porch, now flanked by 2 deputies who had been told to keep him there, but not to touch him until detectives arrived. He watched the organized chaos with what could only be described as interest. When Mrs. Patterson appeared in her bathrobe, crying into her hands, Evan's gaze followed her with detached observation. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at 11:20. She'd been pulled from her daughter's school play, still wearing dress slacks and heels inappropriate for a crime scene. But her mind was already working, processing, cataloging. She approached Evan carefully, crouching down to his eye level on the porch steps. She introduced herself gently, her voice warm despite the circumstances. She asked his name, though she already knew it. She asked if he was hurt anywhere. Evan shook his head. She asked if he could tell her what happened tonight. Evan looked directly into her eyes and delivered a story that was too perfect, too practiced. He said 2 men had broken in through the back door. He said they wore masks and dark clothes. He said he heard his grandparents yelling and then silence, and when he came downstairs the men were gone and his grandparents wouldn't wake up. He delivered this account without stumbling, without the natural pauses and emotional breaks that traumatized children exhibit. Detective Chen nodded slowly, thanked him for the information, and made a mental note. This child was lying. The inside of the house told a story that contradicted every word Evan had spoken. There was no forced entry anywhere. Every door and window was intact, locked from the inside except for the front door and the back door leading to the garden. The back door was slightly ajar, but examination showed it had been opened from the inside, not broken into. The living room was a scene of violence that made even seasoned investigators pause. Martin's body lay beside his overturned chair, blood pooled beneath him, his face turned toward the television that was still playing the late news. Teacup fragments were scattered across the floor. In the hallway, Helen's body rested against the wall beneath the shattered picture frame. Her hand was outstretched, fingers curled slightly, as if she'd been reaching for something in her final moments. The brass candlestick had been wiped clean and placed back on the mantel, but luminol testing would later reveal traces of blood in the decorative grooves that no amount of wiping could remove. Forensic photographer Davis moved through the scene methodically, his camera flash creating stark moments of illumination in the darkened rooms. He photographed the blood spatter patterns on the walls, the overturned furniture, the broken glass. When he reached the shattered picture frame in the hallway, he noticed something crucial. There was a partial fingerprint in blood on one of the larger glass fragments. Not a glove smear, not a palm print, but a clear ridge pattern from someone's index finger. He called Detective Chen over immediately. She examined it with a magnifying lens, then looked back toward the front porch where Evan sat. The print was small, too small to belong to an adult male intruder. Chen ordered it photographed and preserved with the highest priority. As the night stretched toward dawn, more evidence began to emerge. Officer Ramirez discovered muddy footprints leading from the back door to the garden shed and back again. The prints were distinct, made by athletic shoes, youth size based on their dimensions. In the shed, investigators found a black trash bag partially hidden behind paint cans. Inside were clothing items, a dark hoodie and sweatpants, damp and smelling of cleaning solution. There were also rubber gloves, the disposable kind, wadded up and showing signs of having been worn. And there were cleaning wipes, the heavy-duty kind Martin kept for workshop messes, several of them stained dark. Someone had tried to destroy evidence. Someone who had access to the house, knew where the cleaning supplies were kept, and had time to attempt a cover-up. Detective Chen stood in the shed doorway, her flashlight illuminating the bag's contents, and felt her jaw tighten. This wasn't the work of random intruders interrupted during a burglary. This was personal, planned, and executed by someone who lived here. Back on the porch, Evan had been asked to wait while arrangements were made. A social services representative was being called. Procedures followed. Evan showed no signs of distress or trauma. He didn't ask about his grandparents. He didn't ask to call his mother. He didn't cry or shake or show any of the responses detectives had come to expect from children in crisis. Instead, at one point, he asked Deputy Keller if he could go back inside to get his tablet because he'd been in the middle of a game. Keller stared at him in disbelief, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The deputy said that wouldn't be possible right now. Evan shrugged, leaned back against the porch railing, and resumed his quiet observation of the scene. Detective Chen watched him from inside the house, through the front window, and made another mental note. She'd been in law enforcement for 16 years, had interviewed hundreds of witnesses and suspects, had seen shock manifest in countless ways. But this wasn't shock. This was something else entirely. This was a child completely comfortable in the aftermath of violence. And that comfort, more than anything else she'd seen that night, told her exactly who was responsible for the silence inside the row house. Evan was transported to the county juvenile facility at 3 a.m. Standard procedure required that he be separated from the crime scene and placed in protective custody until family could be located and the situation assessed. He went without protest, sitting in the back of an unmarked car with a blanket around his shoulders that he didn't need. Detective Chen followed in her own vehicle, her mind already working through the next steps. Among the items collected from the scene was Evan's tablet, a slightly outdated model with a cracked screen protector that Martin and Helen had given him the previous Christmas. It was password protected, but the forensic team had tools for that. By 7 in the morning, while Evan slept soundly in a monitored room, a digital forensics specialist named Marcus Webb was beginning to unlock the device's secrets. Webb had been doing this work for a decade, extracting data from phones and computers in cases ranging from fraud to violence. He'd seen disturbing content before, messages and searches that revealed the darkest corners of human intention. But as he bypassed Evan's simple 4-digit code and began combing through the tablet's contents, he felt a chill settle into his bones. The browser history alone told a story that transformed the investigation from suspicious to damning. Webb cataloged each entry carefully, time-stamping them, ensuring the chain of evidence remained unbroken. What he found was a roadmap of premeditation that no defense attorney would be able to explain away. This wasn't a child acting on impulse or rage. This was a child who had researched, planned, and prepared. The searches began 3 weeks before that Thursday night. They started almost innocuously. Questions about independence, about living alone, about what happened to kids whose parents or guardians passed away. But they evolved quickly into something far more sinister. 2 weeks out, the searches became specific. How hard do you have to strike someone to cause unconsciousness? Whether a 13-year-old could be charged as an adult. The difference between accidents and intentional acts in legal terms. What evidence police look for at crime scenes. Webb highlighted each search, his expression growing darker with every entry. These weren't random curiosities. These were the questions of someone gathering intelligence, planning an operation, thinking through consequences, and how to avoid them. The day of the incident itself revealed the most chilling timeline. That Thursday morning, hours before Martin and Helen would take their last breaths, Evan had searched for information about blunt force trauma. He'd looked up how long it takes for someone to lose consciousness from head injuries. He'd researched whether security cameras could see in the dark and how far their range typically extended. In the early afternoon, he'd visited forums where people discussed true crime cases, reading threads about killers who'd been caught and how they'd made mistakes. He'd paid particular attention to posts about fingerprints and DNA evidence, and at 4:37, just hours before dinner, he'd typed a search that made Webb immediately call Detective Chen. The search read, "Can kids go to jail forever if nobody saw them do it?" But the browser history was only the beginning. Webb moved into Evan's messaging applications, pulling up conversations with online contacts whose usernames suggested they were other teenagers, though their actual identities were impossible to verify. The messages went back months, revealing a side of Evan that his grandparents had never seen. He complained constantly about Helen and Martin, describing them as wardens and jailers. He talked about feeling trapped, about wanting freedom, about how adults controlled every aspect of his life. His contacts offered sympathy, shared their own frustrations with parents and rules. But Evan's complaints escalated beyond normal teenage rebellion. He began making statements that should have alarmed anyone reading them. He talked about how much better life would be without supervision. He mentioned that his grandparents were old, that they wouldn't be around forever anyway, that maybe he could speed up the natural process. One conversation from 2 weeks before the incident stood out with terrible clarity. Evan had been chatting with someone using the name Dark Knight, trading messages about video games and music. Then Evan had typed something that shifted the entire tone. He wrote that he'd figured out how to solve his problem. Dark Knight asked what he meant. Evan responded that he couldn't say exactly, but that soon things would be different. Dark Knight sent a laughing emoji and said something vague about doing what you have to do. Evan replied with a single sentence that Webb highlighted in yellow and flagged as critical evidence. He wrote, "Tonight I get my freedom. Wish me luck." The timestamp on that message was Thursday at 9:45, less than half an hour before the estimated time of the attacks. It had been typed but never sent, left sitting in the draft folder, waiting. Webb dug deeper into the tablet's memory, recovering deleted files that Evan had thought were gone forever. There were voice memos, recordings Evan had made to himself over the past month. In them, he talked through his plans like someone rehearsing a presentation. His voice was calm, methodical, almost clinical. He described the layout of the house, noting which floorboards creaked and which doors made noise. He talked about the candlestick on the mantel, mentioning how heavy it was, how solid. He discussed the best time to act, when his grandparents would be relaxed and unsuspecting. In one recording from 3 days before the incident, Evan's voice took on an excited quality as he said he was almost ready, that he just needed to wait for the right moment. He ended that particular memo by saying, "After this, no more rules, no more being told what to do, just me, free." The most damning piece of evidence was a video file that had been recorded on Thursday evening itself. Webb found it buried in a folder labeled with random numbers, clearly meant to be hidden. He opened the file and watched as Evan's face filled the screen, illuminated by the tablet's glow in what appeared to be his darkened bedroom. The timestamp read 8:54, just over an hour before the attacks. Evan was whispering, his eyes bright with anticipation. He spoke directly to the camera as if recording a message for his future self. He said tonight was the night. He said he'd been planning this for weeks, and now everything was ready. He said his grandparents thought he was just a kid, thought they could control him, but they were about to learn otherwise. His hands moved in and out of frame as he spoke, gesturing, emphasizing points. And then, in the final seconds of the video, Evan smiled that same smile that would later haunt the courtroom. He whispered, "Tonight, I become free. Watch me." Webb sat back from his workstation, removed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. In a decade of forensic work, he'd never seen such clear documentation of premeditated intent from someone so young. This wasn't a collection of angry rants or impulsive threats made in moments of frustration. This was a deliberate chronicle of planning and anticipation. Every search, every message, every recording built toward a single conclusion. Evan Rowe had decided his grandparents needed to be removed, had spent weeks preparing himself mentally and practically, and had executed his plan with chilling focus. Webb compiled everything into a comprehensive report, organized chronologically, with each piece of evidence clearly documented and preserved. When he finally called Detective Chen to brief her on the findings, his first words were simple and devastating. He said, "We have everything. This case is airtight." Detective Chen listened to Webb's summary over the phone, making notes on a legal pad that was quickly filling with highlighted sections and circled phrases. When he finished, she thanked him and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the wall of her office. She'd known from the moment she saw Evan on that porch that something was deeply wrong. But having confirmation, having documented proof of planning and intent, changed everything. This wasn't a case that could be handled quietly through juvenile services and counseling. This was a case that would need to be presented to the district attorney with a recommendation that would shock the community. She picked up her phone and made the call she'd been dreading. Within hours, legal teams would be convened, precedents researched, and a decision made that would place a 13-year-old child in a courtroom facing charges typically reserved for adults. But first, there was one more piece of evidence that needed to be examined. A neighbor's security camera had been running all night, and what it captured would remove any remaining doubt about who was responsible for the silence that had fallen over the Rowe house. Mr. Chen, who lived directly across the street from the Rowe home, had installed a security camera system 6 months earlier after a string of vehicle break-ins in the neighborhood. The cameras covered his driveway, front yard, and had a wide-angle view that happened to capture a portion of the Rowe property, specifically the side yard and the path leading to the back garden. He'd mentioned the system to Martin once during a neighborhood barbecue, and they'd joked about living in safer times when cameras weren't necessary. Now that same system was about to provide evidence that would eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt. Detective Chen arrived at Mr. Chen's home at 9 in the morning, accompanied by a video analyst from the forensic lab. Mr. Chen, still shaken from the previous night's events, led them to his home office where the camera system's recording device was stored. The footage was digital, time-stamped, and stored on a hard drive with a week's worth of continuous recording. The analyst copied the files from Thursday evening, focusing on the hours between 9 and midnight. They returned to the station and loaded the footage onto a large monitor in the conference room. Detective Chen called in the lead prosecutor, District Attorney Catherine Morrison, who had been briefed on the case and was already considering the unprecedented step of pursuing adult charges. Together they watched the screen as the analyst queued up the relevant timeline. The image quality was surprisingly clear, even in the limited light from street lamps and the Rose outdoor fixtures. The timestamp in the corner read 10:14, just 2 minutes after the estimated time when Helen had poured tea for Martin. For several minutes nothing moved in the frame except shadows from tree branches swaying in the breeze. Then at 10:23 a figure emerged from the side door of the row house. Even in the grainy footage the size and build were unmistakable. It was Evan. He was dragging something behind him, a dark object that appeared heavy and awkward. He struggled with it momentarily at the doorway, then pulled it down the 3 steps to the yard level. The analyst paused the footage and zoomed in as much as the resolution would allow. The object was a large black trash bag, bulging and misshapen. Evan dragged it across the yard toward the garden shed, the bag leaving a faint trail in the damp grass. He disappeared behind the shed for approximately 4 minutes. When he reappeared, his hands were empty, and he walked back toward the house with a noticeably different posture, more relaxed, almost casual. But Evan didn't go back inside immediately. The footage showed him standing in the yard for a long moment, looking up at the sky, his face tilted toward the stars. Then he did something that made everyone in the conference room lean forward. He began to move his lips, appearing to speak or sing to himself, though there was no audio on the security footage. A neighbor had reported hearing soft singing during this time window, and now they had visual confirmation. Evan stood there for nearly 3 minutes, swaying slightly, his hands at his sides, apparently lost in his own world. There was no panic, no horror, no distress. Just a boy standing in his backyard in the middle of the night, moments after committing an act of terrible violence, appearing completely at peace. The analyst fast-forwarded through the next segment, where Evan finally returned to the house. The timestamp showed 10:32. For the next 11 minutes, nothing appeared in the frame. Then, at 10:43, the exact time Mrs. Patterson's 911 call was logged, Evan emerged from the front of the house and walked calmly to the porch swing. The camera's angle only caught the edge of the porch, but his movement was visible. He sat, began swinging gently, and remained there until the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the street. The footage continued through the arrival of law enforcement, the controlled chaos of the response, the arrival of ambulances and investigators. Through it all, Evans sat on that swing, barely moving, watching everything unfold as if he were a spectator at a play. District Attorney Morrison paused the footage and turned to Detective Chen. Her expression was grim but resolved. She said what they were both thinking. This footage, combined with the digital evidence from the tablet, created an ironclad case. There was no intruder. There was no alternative explanation. The timeline was perfect, the behavior undeniable. A 13-year-old child had planned and executed the taking of 2 lives, attempted to hide evidence, and then calmly waited to see what would happen next. Morrison made a decision that would set legal precedent in the state. She would file charges in adult court, seeking the maximum allowable sentence under a blended juvenile-adult framework. It would be controversial, possibly unprecedented for someone Evan's age. But the evidence demanded it. The community deserved it. And Helen and Martin Rowe deserved justice that matched the calculated nature of what had been done to them. Before presenting the case to a grand jury, Morrison wanted every piece of evidence documented and cross-referenced. She ordered a complete forensic reconstruction of the crime scene, matching the physical evidence inside the house with the timeline established by the security footage. Blood spatter analysts worked backward from the positions of the bodies, determining the likely sequence and location of each strike. Their findings were consistent with someone entering the living room from the stairs, approaching Martin from behind, and then pursuing Helen into the hallway when she attempted to flee. The brass candlestick, despite being wiped clean, yielded traces of both victims' DNA in microscopic amounts that even vigorous cleaning couldn't remove. The fingerprint on the broken picture frame came back as a definitive match to Evan's right index finger, placed there in Helen's blood during the struggle. The forensic team also analyzed the clothing found in the trash bag in the shed. The hoodie and sweatpants showed spatter patterns consistent with being worn during a violent assault. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of cleaning solution, but not enough to eliminate all trace evidence. Microscopic blood drops were recovered and matched to both Martin and Helen. The rubber gloves showed internal DNA traces from the wearer. Evan's skin cells, transferred through perspiration. Even his attempt to destroy evidence had left a trail that led directly back to him. The team compiled a report that read like a textbook example of forensic investigation. Every element supported the same conclusion. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same suspect. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, no room for alternative theories. Detective Chen conducted follow-up interviews with neighbors, teachers, and family friends, building a comprehensive profile of Evan's behavior in the months leading up to the incident. What emerged was a troubling pattern that many had noticed, but few had fully understood. Teachers reported that Evan showed no empathy when other students were hurt or upset. He'd been caught making threatening statements that were dismissed as jokes or attempts at dark humor. A school counselor recalled an incident where Evan had described in disturbing detail how he would handle someone who made him angry, using language that suggested he'd thought about it extensively. Neighbors recounted strange behaviors, watching people from his bedroom window for extended periods, following younger children in the neighborhood, an incident where another family's dog became suddenly terrified of him after being left alone in the yard. Caroline, Evan's mother, was located in a neighboring state where she'd been working at a restaurant and trying to rebuild her life. When Detective Chen reached her by phone and explained what had happened, Caroline's first response was silence so long that Chen thought the call had dropped. Then came a sound like something breaking, a sob that turned into a wail of disbelief and grief. Caroline kept repeating that it wasn't possible, that Evan was just a boy, that her parents had been helping him. But when Chen gently mentioned some of the behavioral concerns that had been reported, Caroline's denials became quieter. She admitted there had been incidents before Evan went to live with his grandparents, small acts of cruelty toward animals, a fascination with fires, threats made to other children that resulted in him being removed from 2 different schools. She'd hoped that Helen and Martin's structure and love would change him. She desperately wanted to believe he could be saved. Now she was being told that her son had taken away the 2 people who'd tried hardest to help him. The grand jury convened on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after that terrible Thursday night. The proceedings were closed, but the evidence presented was overwhelming. Prosecutors walked the jurors through the timeline, showed them the security footage, played portions of Evan's self-recorded video. They presented the search history, the deleted messages, the forensic evidence from the scene. They explained the legal framework for charging a juvenile as an adult, the specific criteria that had to be met, and how this case exceeded every threshold. The grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was steady and clear. True bill on all counts. Evan Rowe would stand trial in adult court for 2 counts of first-degree intentional harm, resulting in death. He would face justice not as a child who'd made a terrible mistake, but as someone who'd planned, prepared, and executed an act of calculated violence. The defense would have their chance to argue mitigating factors, to present evidence of his age and development. But first, they'd have to contend with a video that showed Evan smiling into a camera, whispering about freedom, counting down the hours until his grandparents would no longer stand in his way. While the digital evidence was being compiled and the security footage analyzed, investigators conducting a thorough search of Evan's bedroom discovered something that added another disturbing dimension to the case. Tucked beneath his mattress, wrapped in an old T-shirt as if hidden with care, was a spiral-bound notebook with a black cover. Detective Chen pulled on fresh gloves before opening it, immediately recognizing that what she was looking at went far beyond typical teenage journaling. The pages were filled with drawings, fragments of text, symbols repeated over and over with obsessive precision. Each page revealed more of Evan's inner world, a landscape of dark fascination and careful planning that had been developing for months while Helen and Martin slept peacefully down the hall, unaware of what their grandson was creating in the darkness. The drawings were crude but deliberate, rendered in black ink and occasional red marker. The first several pages showed clocks, dozens of them, all stopped at different times, their hands frozen, their faces cracked or shattered. Beneath each clock was a date, some from weeks past, others from days leading up to that Thursday. It appeared Evan had been marking time, counting down to something, each stopped clock representing another day closer to his goal. The imagery was repetitive and intense, suggesting an obsession with time running out or time stopping altogether. Between the clocks were sketches of doors, some open, some closed, some with chains drawn across them in heavy black lines. Keys appeared frequently, sometimes drawn realistically, other times abstract and symbolic, as if representing freedom or access to something previously locked away. The most disturbing drawings appeared in the middle section of the notebook. Stick figures, rendered simply but with enough detail to convey their meaning, lay scattered across pages. They were drawn in various positions, always horizontal, always still, sometimes with dark pools of ink spreading beneath them. In several drawings, 2 figures lay in different rooms, separated by lines that appeared to represent walls or doorways. The resemblance to the actual crime scene layout was impossible to ignore. One drawing showed a larger figure slumped in what looked like a chair, while another showed a smaller figure standing nearby, holding something elongated and dark. Detective Chen photographed each page methodically, ensuring every detail was captured and preserved. This wasn't random artistic expression. This was visualization, rehearsal, a child working through his intentions on paper before carrying them out in reality. Text fragments appeared throughout the notebook, written in Evan's careful handwriting, sometimes neat and controlled, other times scrawled with obvious emotion. Short phrases jumped out from the pages like shouts in the darkness. "They're in my way. I'm almost ready. Kids can't be punished. Freedom is silence. After this, no more voices telling me what to do." The statements weren't organized chronologically or thematically. They appeared scattered across pages, as if Evan had written them whenever the thoughts came to him. Some were dated, others weren't. But together they formed a clear narrative of escalating resentment and planning. These weren't the anguished writings of a child crying out for help. They were the calculated notations of someone convincing themselves that what they were about to do was necessary and justified. One symbol appeared more frequently than any other element in the notebook. It was a simple design, a circle with a horizontal line through the center and a vertical line extending upward from the top. Evan had drawn it dozens of times, sometimes small in the corners of pages, sometimes large and elaborate, taking up entire sheets. He'd carved it into the back cover of the notebook with a pen pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the cardboard. Detective Chen photographed it carefully, then called in a forensic psychologist to review the notebook's contents. Dr. Patricia Sanchez arrived that afternoon and spent 3 hours examining every page, making notes, cross-referencing the drawings and text against known psychological markers. Her preliminary assessment was chilling. The symbol, she explained, appeared to be Evan's personal creation, what he called his freedom mark, based on a caption found on one page. It represented his vision of liberation, of breaking free from constraint. Dr. Sanchez pointed out the progression visible in the notebook's pages. The early entries from months ago showed abstract frustration and anger expressed through aggressive imagery and disconnected thoughts. But as the pages advanced, the content became more focused, more specific, more directed toward a particular outcome. The stopped clock suggested planning around a specific timeline. The door imagery represented barriers he intended to remove. The stick figures were rehearsals of action, mental preparation for something terrible. The text fragments showed his reasoning, his justifications, his attempts to convince himself that what he was planning was acceptable because of his age, because of his circumstances, because his grandparents were obstacles to the life he wanted. Dr. Sanchez's conclusion was unambiguous. This notebook documented the psychological journey from fantasy to intention to commitment. Evan hadn't acted on impulse or in a moment of rage. He'd been building toward this for a very long time. The notebook was compared against Evan's tablet contents, and the overlap was striking. Dates when he'd made disturbing internet searches corresponded with pages in the notebook where his drawings became more violent or his written statements more resolved. The day he'd searched for information about blunt force trauma, he'd drawn a detailed image of what appeared to be a candlestick, labeled with the word heavy. 3 days before the incident, when he'd recorded that voice memo about being almost ready, he'd written in the notebook, "Thursday. They won't expect it. I'll wait until they're relaxed. No turning back after this." The evidence from multiple sources was converging into a single, undeniable narrative. This wasn't a sudden break, a moment of lost control, or a child failing to understand consequences. This was methodical, considered, and frighteningly self-aware. Investigators also discovered loose pages tucked into the notebook's back pocket, what appeared to be practice scenarios written out like scripts. In one, Evan had written dialogue for what he would say if questioned by police. He'd planned responses about masked intruders, about being scared and hiding, about not seeing anything clearly. In another, he'd written a timeline for cleaning up afterward, listing steps like remove clothes, use cleaning solution, hide everything in shed, and act normal. These weren't the confused thoughts of a child who didn't understand what he was doing. They were the careful preparations of someone who understood completely and was actively working to avoid consequences. The defense would later argue that Evan's young age meant his brain wasn't fully developed, that he couldn't truly grasp the permanence of his actions. But this notebook suggested otherwise. It showed planning, consequence assessment, and attempts at manipulation. It showed someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. When confronted with the notebook during a supervised interview, Evan's reaction provided one more piece of the psychological puzzle. Detective Chen placed the notebook on the table between them, open to a page showing his freedom mark symbol. She asked him what it meant. Evan looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Detective Chen and said something that would be quoted in every psychological evaluation and court filing that followed. He said simply and without emotion, "It means I never lose." Not past tense, not "I thought I wouldn't lose." Present tense, as if even now, sitting in a juvenile facility facing charges that could keep him imprisoned for life, he still believed he was somehow in control, somehow winning a game that only he understood. Detective Chen maintained her professional composure, thanked him for his time, and ended the interview. But later, sitting in her car in the parking lot, She allowed herself a moment to process the profound coldness of that statement. She'd interviewed hardened criminals, career offenders, people who'd committed terrible acts, but she'd never heard someone so young speak with such chilling certainty about their own invincibility. And she knew in that moment that the prosecution's case would need to convey not just what Evan had done, but who he truly was beneath the young face and small frame. The notebook would help them do exactly that. The court ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation before proceeding with trial. It was standard procedure for any juvenile facing adult charges. But in Evan's case, the evaluation took on special significance. The findings would help determine whether he could be held fully accountable for his actions or whether developmental factors significantly impaired his judgment. Dr. Patricia Sanchez conducted the primary evaluation over the course of 6 sessions, each lasting 2 to 3 hours. She met with Evan in a neutral room at the juvenile facility, equipped with recording devices that captured every word, every pause, every subtle shift in expression. What she documented over those sessions would become some of the most compelling and disturbing evidence presented at trial. Evan entered the first session with the same calm demeanor he'd displayed since his arrest. He sat in the chair across from Dr. Sanchez without fidgeting, made appropriate eye contact, and responded to her initial questions with polite, measured answers. On the surface, he appeared to be a well-mannered young man trying to cooperate with the process. But Dr. Sanchez had evaluated hundreds of juveniles over her career, and she recognized immediately that something was fundamentally different about Evan. Most children in his position showed signs of trauma response, dissociation, denial, emotional flooding, or shutdown. Evan showed none of these. He was present, engaged, and remarkably composed for someone facing the possibility of spending most of his life behind bars. That composure itself was a red flag. Dr. Sanchez began with baseline questions about Evan's history, his relationships, his understanding of why he was there. Evan answered each question thoughtfully, his responses articulate beyond his years. He described his early childhood with his mother as chaotic but manageable. He spoke about his father's death with no visible emotion, stating matter-of-factly that it had happened and he'd moved on. When asked about living with his grandparents, his tone shifted slightly, not to sadness or anger, but to something closer to annoyance. He described Helen and Martin as overbearing and controlling. He said they treated him like a child, which he found frustrating. Dr. Sanchez noted the irony of a 13-year-old complaining about being treated like a child, but she didn't interrupt. She let him talk, knowing that the more he spoke, the more he would reveal. When the conversation turned to the night his grandparents were harmed, Evan's demeanor remained steady. Dr. Sanchez asked him directly what had happened. Evan repeated the intruder story he'd told police initially, but his delivery had changed. There was less conviction in his voice, as if he were reciting lines he knew no one believed, but felt obligated to perform anyway. Dr. Sanchez listened without judgment, then gently pointed out that the evidence didn't support his account. She mentioned the security footage, the fingerprint, the digital searches. Evan went quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands. Then he looked up and said something that made Dr. Sanchez's pen pause mid-note. He said, "They were slowing me down. I needed them to stop." It wasn't a confession in the legal sense. His attorney would later argue the statement was made in a clinical setting and misinterpreted, but to Dr. Sanchez, it was a window into Evan's psychological framework. She asked him what he meant by slowing him down. Evan explained, with the same calm tone one might use to describe a scheduling conflict, that his grandparents had too many rules. They controlled when he could use his tablet, what games he could play, when he had to go to bed. They asked too many questions about where he was going and what he was doing. They insisted he attend counseling sessions he didn't think he needed. They were obstacles to the life he wanted to live. Dr. Sanchez asked what kind of life that was. Evan's response was simple and chilling. He said, "One where I make the decisions, where no one tells me what to do, where everything is quiet, and I can just exist the way I want." Dr. Sanchez probed deeper, asking Evan if he understood that his grandparents could no longer exist at all because of what had happened. Did he grasp the permanence of their absence? Evan nodded. She asked if that bothered him. Evan considered the question for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, as if genuinely trying to access feelings that should have been automatic. Finally, he said, "I know I'm supposed to feel bad, but I mostly just feel relieved." The honesty of the statement was startling. Most individuals, even those without empathy, understand the social expectation to express remorse. They perform grief or regret because they know it's expected. Evan didn't bother. He simply stated his emotional reality: relief that the obstacles were gone, absence of the guilt that should have been crushing him. Over subsequent sessions, Dr. Sanchez administered a battery of standardized psychological tests designed to assess empathy, moral reasoning, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Evan's results painted a consistent picture. His cognitive abilities were above average. He was intelligent, articulate, capable of complex reasoning. But his emotional responses were significantly atypical. On empathy measures, he scored in the lowest percentile, showing minimal ability to recognize or respond to others' emotional states. When presented with scenarios involving harm to others, he assessed them intellectually, but demonstrated no emotional reaction. A typical child, when told a story about someone being hurt, would express concern or discomfort. Evan analyzed the scenarios like logic puzzles, noting cause and effect without any visible distress about the suffering involved. Dr. Sanchez reviewed Evan's behavioral history from school records and interviews with teachers. The pattern was unmistakable. From early elementary school, there had been reports of concerning behavior. He'd been caught hurting smaller animals on the playground, showing no remorse when confronted. He'd made threats toward other students that were specific and detailed enough to result in suspensions. In one incident at age 9, he'd choked another child during an argument over a game, stopping only when physically pulled away by a teacher. When asked why he'd done it, he'd said the other child had been annoying him and he'd wanted the child to be quiet. There was no recognition that he could have caused serious harm, no understanding of boundaries, no apparent concern for the victim's fear or pain. These weren't isolated incidents of poor impulse control. They were part of a consistent pattern of behavior that escalated as Evan aged. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Sanchez's evaluation was deeply troubling. Evan displayed clear markers of conduct disorder with callous and unemotional traits, a pattern characterized by lack of empathy, absence of guilt, shallow emotional responses, and persistent violation of social norms and others' rights. He showed signs of narcissistic thinking, believing himself to be exceptional and above the rules that governed others. His planning and execution of the attacks on his grandparents demonstrated capability for sophisticated reasoning and delayed gratification in service of a goal. This wasn't a child acting on impulse or failing to understand consequences. This was a child who understood perfectly well, planned carefully, and acted deliberately. The fact that he was only 13 made the profile more unusual, but it didn't make it less accurate. Dr. Sanchez's final report concluded with an assessment that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. She wrote that while Evan's age meant his brain was still developing in certain areas, particularly those governing long-term planning and risk assessment, his actions demonstrated a level of premeditation and moral understanding sufficient for criminal culpability. He knew what he was doing was wrong, evidenced by his attempts to hide evidence and construct an alibi. He understood the permanence of his actions, evidenced by his research into consequences and legal outcomes. He possessed the cognitive capacity to choose differently, evidenced by weeks of planning during which he could have sought help or changed course. The question wasn't whether Evan understood his actions. The question was whether he cared, and all available evidence suggested he did not. When the defense team received Dr. Sanchez's report, they knew their strategy would have to shift. They couldn't argue that Evan didn't understand what he'd done. The evidence contradicted that narrative too thoroughly. Instead, they would have to argue that understanding wasn't the same as full adult culpability, that age itself was a mitigating factor regardless of cognitive capacity. They brought in their own expert, a psychologist who specialized in adolescent brain development. He would testify about prefrontal cortex maturation, about how even intelligent teenagers lack fully developed capacity for judgment and impulse control. It was a sound legal strategy, and in many cases it might have been effective, but it would have to compete with something more powerful than expert testimony. It would have to compete with Evan's own words, recorded on video, whispered into a camera just hours before he took 2 lives. And it would have to compete with the image that every person in that courtroom would carry with them, a 13-year-old boy sitting at the defense table, showing no remorse, no fear, no recognition that he'd destroyed not just his grandparents' lives, but his own future as well. Dr. Sanchez concluded her report with a warning that prosecutors would quote repeatedly. She wrote that Evan posed an extreme and ongoing risk, that his lack of empathy and his demonstrated willingness to harm others to achieve his goals suggested he would remain dangerous regardless of intervention. It was a clinical assessment, grounded in data and observation, but it read like a prophecy of something dark that couldn't be undone. The day Evan's trial officially began, the courthouse was surrounded by news vans and protesters holding signs with messages that ranged from "Justice for Helen and Martin" to "Children are not monsters." The case had captured national attention, sparking fierce debates about juvenile justice, accountability, and whether someone so young could truly be held to adult standards. Legal experts appeared on morning talk shows arguing both sides. Child advocacy groups issued statements warning against treating a 13-year-old as irredeemable. Victims' rights organizations countered that age shouldn't shield someone from consequences when the evidence of intent was so clear. The community itself was divided, with some residents believing Evan deserved the maximum possible punishment, while others argued that society had failed him long before he failed his grandparents. But inside Courtroom 3, none of that outside noise mattered. What mattered was the evidence, the law, and 12 jurors who would have to decide whether justice demanded mercy or accountability. The gallery filled hours before the proceedings were scheduled to begin. Every seat was claimed, with overflow crowds directed to adjacent rooms where the trial would be broadcast on monitors. Reporters occupied the first 3 rows, laptops open, ready to document every moment for audiences across the country. Behind them sat victim advocates, members of the community who had known Helen and Martin, former students whose lives the couple had touched, neighbors who still couldn't quite believe what had happened in that quiet house on Maple Street. And in the back corner, partially hidden behind a pillar, sat Caroline. Evan's mother looked like she'd aged a decade in the weeks since her parents' passing. Her face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She'd flown back immediately after receiving the news, but the juvenile facility wouldn't allow her to visit Evan without his consent. He'd refused to see her. She came to the trial anyway, torn between grief for her parents and anguish for her son, belonging fully to neither side of the room. When the bailiff announced Judge Marlowe's entrance, the room rose as one. The judge took his seat with the bearing of someone who understood the weight of what was about to unfold. He'd presided over difficult cases before, but nothing quite like this. The youngest defendant he'd ever seen, charged as an adult, had been 16. Evan was 3 years younger, small for his age, his feet barely touching the floor when he sat in the oversized chair at the defense table. Judge Marlowe looked at the boy, then at the packed gallery, then at the legal teams assembled before him. He began with a statement about decorum and respect, reminding everyone present that this was a court of law, not a spectacle, and that outbursts or disruptions would result in immediate removal. His voice carried the authority of someone who didn't make empty threats. The room settled into tense silence. Evan sat between his two defense attorneys, wearing clothes that had been carefully selected to make him appear as young and unthreatening as possible. A collared shirt, khaki pants, hair neatly combed. His lead attorney, Jennifer Martinez, was a veteran of juvenile defense with a reputation for fierce advocacy and an unshakable belief that children deserved second chances. She'd taken Evan's case knowing it would be the most challenging of her career, knowing that public opinion was strongly against her client, knowing that the evidence was damning. But she believed in the principle that the justice system should protect the vulnerable, and in her view, a 13-year-old was still vulnerable regardless of what he'd done. Her co-counsel, David Park, specialized in psychological defenses and would be responsible for presenting expert testimony about Evan's age and development. Together, they represented Evan's only barrier against a sentence that could effectively end his life before it had truly begun. Across from them sat the prosecution team, led by District Attorney Catherine Morrison. She'd built her career on careful case construction and an unwavering commitment to seeking justice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Beside her sat her assistant, James Chen, and Detective Sarah Chen, who had worked the case from that first night and knew every piece of evidence intimately. Morrison had faced criticism for her decision to charge Evan as an adult. Some called it political, others called it cruel. But she'd studied the evidence exhaustively, consulted with experts, reviewed legal precedent, and reached a conclusion she believed was correct. The law allowed for adult prosecution in cases involving severe violence when the evidence showed deliberation and understanding. This case met every criterion. Helen and Martin Rowe deserved an advocate who wouldn't be swayed by Evan's age when that age hadn't stopped him from planning their ending with cold precision. The jury selection had taken 3 days, with both sides carefully questioning potential jurors about their ability to set aside preconceptions and judge the case solely on evidence. The final 12 included a retired teacher, a construction supervisor, a nurse, an accountant, and 8 others from various backgrounds. They'd all sworn they could be impartial, that they could look at a 13-year-old defendant and evaluate the evidence fairly. But as they filed into the jury box and saw Evan for the first time in person, several of them visibly struggled with the cognitive dissonance. He looked so young, so small, so unlike the monster the media had described. And that was precisely what the defense was counting on. Jennifer Martinez knew that her best chance was to keep the jury focused on Evan's age, on the inherent vulnerability of childhood, on the possibility of rehabilitation. If they saw him as a child, they might be merciful. If they saw him as a calculating individual who'd planned his actions, they might not. Judge Marlowe called the court to order and invited the prosecution to present their opening statement. Catherine Morrison rose, buttoned her jacket, and approached the jury box. She didn't use notes. She'd memorized every word, practiced the delivery until it was natural and compelling. She began not with the crime itself, but with the victims. She told the jury about Helen and Martin Rowe, about their decades of service to the community, about their belief in second chances, and their decision to take in a troubled grandson who needed stability and love. She described their home as a place of warmth and safety, a refuge they'd opened to someone they thought they could help. Her voice was measured but carried emotional weight. Several jurors leaned forward, engaged. Then Morrison shifted, her tone hardening slightly. She told them what happened to that warmth and safety on a Thursday evening in autumn. She told them about planning, about research, about a child who spent weeks preparing to remove the 2 people who stood between him and the freedom he desired. Morrison walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The internet searches, the deleted messages, the self-recorded video, the security footage showing Evan dragging evidence to the shed, the fingerprint in blood. the notebook filled with violent imagery and statements of intent. She laid out a timeline that left no room for accident or impulsive action. This was planned. This was deliberate. This was carried out by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and worked to avoid consequences afterward. Morrison's voice rose slightly as she reached her conclusion. She told the jury that they would see and hear disturbing things over the coming days. They would be asked to reconcile Evan's age with his actions. But she urged them to remember one fundamental truth: understanding right from wrong, planning to do wrong anyway, and taking steps to hide that wrong afterward wasn't a matter of age. It was a matter of choice. And Evan Rowe had made his choice with full awareness. She thanked the jury and returned to her seat. The defense's opening was a study in contrasts. Jennifer Martinez approached the jury with a softer demeanor, her voice tinged with sadness rather than righteous anger. She began by acknowledging that something terrible had happened, that 2 lives had been lost, that a family had been shattered. She didn't dispute the basic facts of what occurred, but she asked the jury to consider why. She painted a picture of a boy whose entire childhood had been marked by instability and loss. A father who passed away when Evan needed him most. A mother who struggled and ultimately had to give him up. Grandparents who meant well but couldn't address the deep psychological wounds Evan carried. She spoke about brain development, about how 13-year-olds lack the capacity for full moral reasoning that adults possess. She reminded the jury that the law recognizes this. Children can't vote, can't enter contracts, can't be held to the same standards of judgment as adults. Why, she asked, should criminal culpability be different? Martinez's strategy was to humanize Evan without minimizing what he'd done. She acknowledged his actions were serious and tragic, but she argued they were the actions of a deeply damaged child, not a calculating criminal. She promised the jury would hear from experts about Evan's psychological state, about the treatable conditions that contributed to his behavior, about the potential for rehabilitation if given proper intervention. She asked them to remember throughout the trial that they were judging a child, and that children, even children who do terrible things, deserve the possibility of redemption. Her closing was emotional, without being manipulative. She said that both mercy and justice could coexist, that punishing Evan appropriately didn't require treating him as irredeemable. She asked the jury to listen carefully, consider all the evidence, and remember that they held not just Evan's fate in their hands, but the question of what kind of society they wanted to be. Then she returned to her seat, placing a hand briefly on Evan's shoulder in a gesture of support. Throughout both opening statements, Evan sat motionless at the defense table. He'd been instructed by his attorneys to maintain a respectful, attentive posture to show the jury he was taking the proceedings seriously, but old habits proved hard to break. During Morrison's opening, when she described the security footage of him dragging the trash bag across the yard, a small smile had flickered across his face before he caught himself and suppressed it. During his own attorney's emotional appeal about his troubled childhood, he'd started doodling on the notepad in front of him, drawing those same symbols from his notebook, circles and lines that meant freedom to him and danger to everyone else. Judge Marlowe had noticed. He'd leaned forward and quietly but firmly told Evan to pay attention and sit still. Evan had complied, but the damage was done. Several jurors had seen the smile, the doodling, the disconnect between the sympathetic portrait being painted and the reality of the boy sitting before them. And in that moment, the defense's uphill battle became even steeper. The prosecution's case began with the physical evidence, the kind of concrete proof that couldn't be explained away by theories about brain development or childhood trauma. Catherine Morrison called her first witness, Officer James Morrison, one of the first responders who'd arrived at the Rowe home that night. He took the stand with the solemn bearing of someone who'd seen things he wished he could forget. Morrison walked him through his arrival at the scene, the quiet street suddenly ablaze with emergency lights, the boy on the porch swing who seemed utterly unconcerned about what was happening. Officer Morrison described Evan's demeanor in detail: the calmness, the lack of fear, the strange comment about his grandparents sleeping. The jury listened intently as the officer recounted entering the home and discovering the horror that waited inside. His voice remained professional, but the weight of that night was evident in every word. The prosecution introduced photographs from the crime scene, displayed on large monitors positioned so the jury could see clearly. Judge Marlowe had warned them during selection that they would view difficult images, and now those warnings became reality. The pictures showed the living room where Martin had fallen, the overturned chair, the shattered teacup, the dark stains on the hardwood floor that no amount of cleaning could ever fully erase. They showed the hallway where Helen had made her final stand, the broken picture frame, the smeared handprint where she'd tried to brace herself. The images were clinical, taken by professionals trained to document without emotion, but their impact was devastating. Several jurors looked away momentarily. One dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, another's jaw clenched visibly. The retired teacher on the jury stared at the images with an expression of profound sadness, perhaps seeing in Helen a reflection of herself, someone who dedicated her life to helping children and paid the ultimate price. Morrison called the medical examiner next, Dr. Robert Chen, who had performed the examinations and could speak to the specific injuries sustained. His testimony was technical but necessary, establishing the cause and manner of the victim's passing. He explained that Martin had sustained multiple impacts to the head, consistent with being struck repeatedly by a heavy, blunt object. The injuries were severe, indicating significant force behind each blow. Helen's injuries followed a similar pattern, concentrated on her head and upper body, defensive wounds on her arms suggesting she'd tried to protect herself. Dr. Chen's testimony made clear that these weren't accidental injuries or the result of a brief struggle. They were the result of sustained, deliberate attacks by someone determined to cause fatal harm. The defense chose not to cross-examine extensively, knowing there was little they could challenge in the medical evidence. The facts were the facts. The brass candlestick was introduced as evidence, sealed in a clear evidence bag, labeled and documented. Forensic specialist Maria Gonzalez took the stand to explain what her team had discovered. Despite obvious attempts to clean the object, luminol testing had revealed microscopic traces of blood in the decorative grooves and crevices. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to both Helen and Martin. Additionally, the candlestick bore latent fingerprints that, while partially smudged, included identifiable ridge patterns matching Evan's right hand. Gonzalez displayed enlarged photographs of the print comparisons, walking the jury through the 12 points of similarity that established a definitive match. She explained that the positioning of the prints suggested a grip consistent with wielding the object as a weapon. The defense attorney objected to speculation about grip patterns, and Judge Marlowe sustained the objection, instructing the jury to disregard that last statement. But the damage was done. The image was planted. The fingerprint on the broken picture frame became the focus of the next testimony. Detective Sarah Chen took the stand, and Morrison guided her through the discovery and analysis of this crucial piece of evidence. The print had been found on a large glass shard, preserved in Helen's blood, positioned exactly where someone standing over her would have pressed their hand. The print was remarkably clear, a nearly perfect impression of Evan's right index finger. Detective Chen explained the significance. This wasn't a print that could have been left hours earlier during normal household activity. It was placed at the moment of the incident, in blood that was still wet, by someone who was present when Helen was harmed. The defense would later argue that Evan could have touched the frame while checking on his grandmother, not while attacking her, but the argument felt weak given all the surrounding evidence. The print told a story, and that story placed Evan's hand at the scene of violence. The testimony shifted to the attempts at covering up what had happened. Officer Ramirez described discovering the black trash bag in the garden shed, walking the jury through the contents: clothing soaked with cleaning solution, rubber gloves, used wipes. Each item was photographed and displayed. Forensic analysis had recovered blood traces from the clothing despite the cleaning attempts, with DNA matching both victims. The gloves contained Evan's DNA on the interior surface, transferred through skin cells and perspiration. Morrison presented this evidence methodically, building a picture of someone who not only committed violent acts, but understood the need to hide evidence afterward. This wasn't a child in shock, wandering confused through the aftermath. This was someone executing a plan, following steps they'd thought through in advance, trying to eliminate anything that connected them to what had happened. The security footage from Mr. Chen's camera was played for the jury on a large screen. The courtroom fell silent as the timestamp rolled forward to 10:23. There was Evan, emerging from the side door, dragging the heavy bag across the yard. The video quality was clear enough to see his movements, the way he struggled briefly with the weight, then adjusted his grip and continued toward the shed. The prosecution played the segment 3 times, ensuring the jury absorbed every detail. Then they showed the later footage of Evan standing in the yard, apparently speaking or singing to himself, completely at ease under the night sky. Finally, they showed him walking to the porch swing and settling in to wait. The contrast between Evan's calm behavior and what had just occurred inside the house was jarring. Morrison let the footage speak for itself, offering no additional commentary. Sometimes silence was more powerful than words. The prosecution introduced Evan's tablet into evidence, and Marcus Webb, the digital forensics specialist, walked the jury through his findings. The search history was displayed chronologically on the monitors, each entry appearing in stark black text against a white background. How hard do you have to hit someone to knock them out? Can kids go to jail forever? Is 13 too young for a conviction? The progression was damning, showing clear premeditation and awareness of potential consequences. Webb explained how he'd recovered the deleted message draft. "Tonight, I get my freedom. Wish me luck." And the timestamp that placed it less than 30 minutes before the attacks. Several jurors took notes furiously, underlining key phrases, creating their own timeline of events. The defense attorney cross-examined Webb, trying to suggest that internet searches didn't prove intent, that curious teenagers often look up disturbing topics without acting on them. But the argument felt hollow, given everything else the jury had seen. Then Morrison played the video that Evan had recorded of himself. The courtroom held its collective breath as Evan's face appeared on the screen, illuminated by the tablet's glow, whispering into the camera. His voice was audible despite the low volume, every word captured clearly. "Tonight is the night. I've been planning this for weeks, and now everything is ready. They think I'm just a kid, that they can control me, but they're about to learn otherwise." The jury watched in stunned silence. Some leaned forward as if unable to believe what they were hearing. Others sat back, arms crossed, expressions hardening. When Evan on the video smiled and whispered, "Tonight, I become free. Watch me." Several jurors looked from the screen to the defendant, comparing the boy in the video to the boy at the defense table. They were the same person, and yet somehow, seeing them side by side made the reality more incomprehensible. Caroline broke down during the video. Her quiet sobs carried across the silent courtroom until a victim advocate gently escorted her outside. The jury noticed. They noticed her grief, her horror at seeing her son's face confessing to something unthinkable. Judge Marlowe called a brief recess to allow emotions to settle, but the weight of what everyone had just witnessed lingered in the air like smoke. When court resumed 15 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted. The defense's arguments about childhood and impaired judgment now had to compete with Evan's own voice, his own words, his own declaration of intent. Jennifer Martinez knew her job had just become exponentially harder. The evidence wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. And it came directly from her client's own mouth, in his own words, recorded willingly as a chronicle of what he was about to do. As Morrison rested her presentation of physical and digital evidence, she turned to the jury and said simply, "The evidence speaks for itself. Evan Rowe knew what he was doing, understood it was wrong, and did it anyway." No one in that courtroom could honestly argue otherwise. The prosecution had saved its most powerful evidence for a strategic moment, and now Catherine Morrison stood before the jury ready to deliver what she knew would be the emotional peak of the trial. She'd already shown them the self-recorded video once, but she wanted them to see it again in a different context, not just as proof of premeditation, but as a window into who Evan truly was beneath the young face and small frame. She requested permission to play the video a second time, this time with additional context about when and how it was created. Judge Marlowe granted the request over the defense's objection. The lights dimmed slightly, and once again Evan's face filled the screen, whispering his intentions into the camera with chilling clarity. But this time, Morrison paused the video at key moments to highlight specific details. She froze the frame when Evan smiled, that unmistakable expression of anticipation and excitement. She asked the jury to look at his eyes, to notice the alertness, the focus, the complete absence of confusion or fear. This wasn't someone in the grip of impulse or emotion. This was someone savoring a moment they'd been waiting for. Morrison played the audio again when Evan said, "They think I'm just a kid, that they can control me." She let those words hang in the air, then pointed out what they revealed. Evan understood exactly how others perceived him, understood that his age might be seen as a shield, and seemed to take pleasure in the idea of subverting those expectations. He wasn't a child who didn't understand. He was someone who understood and intended to use misunderstanding to his advantage. Morrison moved to the moment where Evan detailed his planning. "I've been preparing for weeks, and now everything is ready." She asked Marcus Webb, still on the stand, to confirm the timeline. He testified that based on the tablet's data, Evan's concerning searches had indeed begun approximately 3 weeks before that Thursday, with escalating frequency and specificity as the date approached. The video wasn't an exaggeration or boast. It was an accurate representation of sustained, calculated preparation. Morrison then highlighted Evan's closing statement, "Tonight, I become free. Watch me." She asked the jury to consider what freedom meant to Evan. Freedom from rules, freedom from supervision, freedom from the two people who loved him enough to try to help him. And he achieved that freedom through an act of violence he'd choreographed like someone following a script they'd written themselves. The defense team sat rigid at their table, knowing they were watching their case erode in real time. Jennifer Martinez had prepared for this moment, but preparation couldn't fully mitigate the impact of hearing Evan's own voice contradicting every argument she planned to make about impaired judgment and childhood impulsivity. David Park leaned over to whisper something to her, likely discussing whether to object again, but Martinez shook her head slightly. Objecting too much would only draw more attention to the evidence, make it seem like they were desperate to keep the jury from seeing the truth. Sometimes the best strategy was to let the moment pass and try to reframe it later. But both attorneys knew that reframing a video this damning would be nearly impossible. The courtroom reaction to the second viewing was even more intense than the first. Now that the initial shock had worn off, people were processing the details, the implications, the cold calculation in every word Evan spoke. Family members of the victims who had held themselves together during the initial evidence presentation now broke down completely. A woman who'd been Helen's teaching colleague for 20 years stood abruptly and had to be assisted from the courtroom, her hand pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. A man who'd lived next door to the Rose for 3 decades sat with his head in his hands, visibly struggling to reconcile the boy he'd occasionally seen playing in the yard with the voice coming from the speakers describing his grandparents as obstacles to be removed. The jury's reaction was equally telling. The nurse in the second row had tears streaming down her face, though she made no sound. The construction supervisor's expression had hardened into something close to anger, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. The retired teacher looked devastated, her professional life dedicated to the belief that children could be reached and helped, now confronted with a child who seemed to reject the very possibility of redemption. The accountant was taking meticulous notes, her face a mask of concentration, perhaps trying to process the evidence through logic rather than emotion. But even she paused when Evan on the video smiled, her pen hovering over the page as if that moment required no notation because it would be impossible to forget. Morrison concluded her presentation of the video evidence by addressing what she knew the defense would argue. She acknowledged that Evan was 13 years old, that his brain was still developing, that adolescence was a time of poor decision-making and incomplete judgment. But she asked the jury to consider whether any of those factors explained what they'd just witnessed. Teenagers made impulsive decisions, sneaking out, trying substances they shouldn't, saying things they didn't mean in anger. But teenagers didn't typically spend 3 weeks researching how to avoid consequences for violence, recording videos chronicling their intentions, and then executing those plans with the kind of precision Evan had demonstrated. Age might explain impulsivity, she argued, but it didn't explain premeditation. Development might explain poor judgment, but it didn't explain calculated planning. The video showed someone who might be young in years, but demonstrated a capacity for intentional harm that transcended age. The prosecution then called one final witness for this phase of evidence. Detective Sarah Chen, recalled to walk through the totality of what the investigation had revealed. Chen was an effective witness, calm and credible, someone who'd spent weeks immersed in every detail of the case. Morrison asked her to summarize how all the pieces fit together. Chen explained methodically. The notebook showing escalating violent ideation, the internet searches demonstrating awareness of legal consequences, the video proving premeditation, the physical evidence placing Evan at the scene, the security footage showing attempted cover-up, and the complete absence of any evidence supporting the intruder narrative. Each element reinforced the others, creating a web of proof that allowed for only one conclusion. Evan Rowe had planned and executed the intentional ending of his grandparents' lives, knowing it was wrong, understanding the permanence of his actions, and attempting to avoid accountability afterward. During Chen's testimony, Evan's behavior at the defense table drew attention once again. He'd been instructed repeatedly to sit still, look attentive, and show appropriate seriousness. But as Chen described finding his notebook with its violent drawings, Evan's lips curved into a small, involuntary smile. It was brief, just a flicker, but 3 jurors in the front row saw it clearly. Martinez noticed them noticing and immediately placed her hand on Evan's arm, leaning close to whisper what was undoubtedly a sharp reminder about courtroom behavior. Evan's expression flattened, but the damage was done. That smile, combined with the one they'd seen in the video, created a pattern. This wasn't a child paralyzed by the gravity of his situation. This was someone who seemed almost pleased by the attention, by the dramatic retelling of his actions, by the recognition of his planning and execution. Morrison played one final piece of audio, a portion of Evan's interview with Dr. Sanchez where he'd said, "They were slowing me down. I needed them to stop." The clinical setting of the recording, the matter-of-fact tone, the complete absence of remorse or recognition of wrongdoing, hit the jury with renewed force. Morrison let the audio play twice, ensuring every word was absorbed. Then she approached the jury box, her voice dropping to a more intimate volume, as if sharing a difficult truth with friends. She said that over the coming days they would hear arguments about brain development and childhood trauma. They would be asked to see Evan as a victim of circumstances, as someone who deserves pity and rehabilitation rather than punishment. But she urged them to remember what they'd seen and heard today. Remember Evan's own words. Remember the planning. Remember the smile. And remember that Helen and Martin Rowe deserved an advocate, because they could no longer speak for themselves. When Morrison returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Judge Marlowe called for a 30-minute recess, and as the jury filed out, several of them cast long looks at Evan. He met their gazes without flinching, without shame, without any of the discomfort that would be natural for someone facing such scrutiny. He simply looked back at them with those dark, unreadable eyes, as if waiting to see what they would do next, as if their judgment was merely another step in a process he was observing with detached curiosity. Jennifer Martinez gathered her files and whispered urgently to David Park. They both knew what came next. They had to present their case, their experts, their arguments about age and development. But how do you defend someone against their own voice? How do you ask for mercy when the defendant seems incapable of seeking it himself? How do you convince 12 people that a child deserves a second chance when that child had looked into a camera and promised to do exactly what he did? Martinez didn't have answers yet, but she had less than 24 hours to find them. The prosecution had just delivered a master class in evidence presentation. Now the defense had to find a way to respond. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, Caroline wept for parents she would never see again, and a son she no longer recognized. The defense began their case on a Wednesday morning, and the atmosphere in the courtroom felt different somehow, weighted with expectation and skepticism. Jennifer Martinez knew she was facing an uphill battle unlike any in her career. The evidence against Evan wasn't circumstantial or ambiguous. It was concrete, documented, and delivered partially in his own voice. But she'd built her reputation on fighting for children the system wanted to discard, and she wasn't about to stop now. Her strategy was clear. She couldn't dispute what Evan had done, so she needed to reframe why it mattered, why his age was more than just a number, why society's obligation to children didn't disappear when those children did terrible things. She stood before the jury with a file folder in her hands and began calling witnesses who would paint a different picture of Evan Rowe, not innocent, but explainable. Her first witness was Dr. Michael Brennan, a neuropsychologist who specialized in adolescent brain development. He took the stand with the comfortable authority of someone who'd testified dozens of times, explaining complex scientific concepts in language accessible to laypeople. Martinez walked him through his credentials, decades of research, hundreds of publications, expertise recognized nationally. Then she asked him to explain to the jury how a 13-year-old's brain differed from an adult's. Dr. Brennan used a model of the human brain as a visual aid, pointing to the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences. He explained that this region didn't fully mature until the mid-20s, that adolescents literally processed risk and reward differently than adults, that their capacity for moral reasoning was still developing. Martinez asked the critical question, could a 13-year-old understand the difference between right and wrong? Dr. Brennan's answer was nuanced. Yes, he said, adolescents generally understood basic moral concepts, but understanding something intellectually wasn't the same as having the neurological capacity to consistently apply that understanding in decision-making. He compared it to knowing that touching a hot stove causes pain, but still being drawn to touch it out of curiosity. Teenagers could know something was wrong and still struggle to override impulses or desires that drove them toward that wrong action. Their brains were wired differently, more reactive, less capable of the kind of careful deliberation that adults took for granted. In Evan's case, Dr. Brennan argued, his actions, while terrible, were consistent with a brain that hadn't yet developed full executive function. The prosecution's cross-examination was surgical. Catherine Morrison approached Dr. Brennan with respect, but challenged his conclusions directly. She asked if brain development explained premeditation spanning 3 weeks. Dr. Brennan acknowledged that was unusual but not impossible in an adolescent. Morrison asked if underdeveloped prefrontal cortex explained researching how to avoid consequences. Dr. Brennan said teenagers could still plan, they just might not fully grasp long-term implications. Morrison then asked the question she'd been building toward. Did brain development explain recording a video documenting intent, hiding evidence, constructing an alibi, and showing no remorse afterward? Dr. Brennan hesitated. He said those behaviors were concerning and atypical, but still occurred within the context of an adolescent brain. Morrison pressed further. She asked if any amount of brain immaturity explained complete absence of empathy. Dr. Brennan admitted that empathy deficits suggested something beyond typical development, possibly trauma-related, possibly indicative of a conduct disorder. Morrison thanked him and sat down, satisfied that she'd shown the jury that even the defense's expert couldn't fully explain Evan's behavior through development alone. The defense called a series of character witnesses next, people who'd known Evan at different stages of his life. A former elementary school teacher described him as quiet and withdrawn, a child who seemed to carry sadness beyond his years. A neighbor recalled him as polite when spoken to, always saying please and thank you, never causing obvious trouble. Caroline's former employer testified that she'd met Evan a few times and he'd seemed like a normal kid, maybe a bit reserved. These testimonies were meant to humanize Evan, to show the jury that before the tragedy he'd been a child trying to navigate a difficult life. But under cross-examination, each witness had to acknowledge they hadn't seen Evan regularly in recent years, didn't know about the behavioral incidents at school, weren't aware of the concerning patterns that teachers and counselors had documented. The testimonies felt hollow, snapshots from a past that didn't connect to the present. Dr. Patricia Sanchez was called by the prosecution as a rebuttal witness, her earlier evaluation now central to the case. Morrison asked her to explain the difference between typical adolescent behavior and what Evan had demonstrated. Dr. Sanchez was clear and clinical. Typical adolescents showed poor impulse control, acting without thinking, making risky decisions in the moment. Evan showed sustained planning over weeks, demonstrating impulse control in service of a goal. Typical adolescents felt guilt and remorse when they hurt others. Evan showed none, describing his grandparents' removal as necessary and feeling primarily relief. Typical adolescents struggled with empathy but still possessed the capacity for it. Evan's testing and behavior suggested fundamental empathy deficits that went beyond normal development. Dr. Sanchez's conclusion was devastating. While age was relevant to sentencing considerations, it didn't negate culpability when someone demonstrated this level of awareness and intentionality. The defense's psychological expert, Dr. Helena Torres, took the stand to challenge Dr. Sanchez's assessment. Dr. Torres specialized in childhood trauma and argued that Evan's behavior was better understood as a trauma response than as inherent pathology. She walked through Evan's history, losing his father young, his mother's instability, being passed between relatives, never having consistent attachment figures. She argued that these experiences had fundamentally altered Evan's psychological development, creating attachment disorders and emotional dysregulation that manifested as the behaviors everyone had witnessed. In her view, Evan wasn't a child without empathy. He was a child whose trauma had taught him that emotional connection was dangerous, that self-protection required emotional distance. His actions, while terrible, were the desperate measures of someone whose entire childhood had been about survival. Morrison's cross-examination of Dr. Torres was respectful but pointed. She asked if trauma explained specific, calculated planning. Dr. Torres said trauma could impair judgment and create hypervigilance that looked like planning. Morrison asked if trauma explained the absence of remorse. Dr. Torres said traumatized children sometimes couldn't access emotions that felt unsafe. Morrison then asked the question that cut to the heart of the issue. Did Dr. Torres believe Evan's trauma made him not responsible for his actions, or simply less responsible? Dr. Torres paused before answering. She said trauma provided context but didn't eliminate responsibility. It should, however, inform how society responded to that responsibility. Morrison noted the answer and moved on, satisfied that even the defense's expert acknowledged Evan bore responsibility for what he'd done. The trial's momentum shifted during the prosecution's presentation of victim impact evidence. Morrison called several people who'd known Helen and Martin not to establish guilt, that was clear, but to remind the jury what had been lost. A former student of Martin's, now a successful attorney, testified about how Martin had stayed after school every day for a month to help him prepare for college entrance exams, how that investment had changed his life trajectory. A mother whose daughter had been in Helen's class described how Helen had seen potential in a child everyone else had given up on, how her patience and belief had helped that child overcome learning disabilities and eventually graduate with honors. These testimonies weren't about evidence, they were about humanity, about two lives that had touched countless others, about a loss that rippled far beyond a quiet house on Maple Street. The most powerful victim impact statement came from someone unexpected, a former foster child Helen and Martin had taken in for 6 months 20 years earlier. The woman, now in her 30s with children of her own, took the stand with visible emotion. She testified that Helen and Martin had been the first adults in her life who made her feel safe, who showed her that homes could be places of peace rather than fear. They'd helped her heal from her own trauma, taught her what family could look like, given her a foundation that allowed her to build a life. She looked directly at Evan as she spoke, her voice breaking. She said Helen and Martin had believed every child deserved love and second chances. They'd devoted their lives to that belief, and that belief had been their ending. She asked the jury to remember that when they considered mercy for someone who'd shown none. By the time both sides rested their cases, the courtroom felt exhausted, emotionally drained from days of testimony that had ranged from clinical to devastating. Judge Marlowe announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning, giving both legal teams the evening to prepare their final appeals to the jury. As people filed out, conversations rippled through the gallery, arguments about justice and mercy, debates about whether children could be irredeemable, questions about what message the verdict would send. Caroline sat alone long after most people had left, staring at the empty witness stand, perhaps imagining her parents there, speaking for themselves, telling the world what it felt like to love someone who destroyed you for the crime of caring. And at the defense table, Evan gathered his papers calmly, showing no more emotion at the trial's conclusion than he'd shown throughout. He asked his attorney when he could get his tablet back. Martinez stared at him for a long moment, then simply said they'd discuss it later. Some questions didn't deserve answers. Some moments revealed everything that needed to be known. And in that moment, Jennifer Martinez understood with crushing clarity that no matter how skillfully she argued, no matter how many experts testified about brain development and trauma, the jury had already seen the truth. They'd seen it in Evan's smile. They'd heard it in his voice on that video. They'd recognized it in his complete inability to grasp why any of this should matter to him. The verdict was coming, and mercy, she suspected, would not be part of it. The courtroom on verdict day held a different kind of tension than it had throughout the trial. This wasn't the anticipatory energy of evidence being revealed or witnesses being cross-examined. This was the suffocating weight of finality, the knowledge that within hours 12 people would render a judgment that would define the rest of Evan Rowe's life. The jury had deliberated for nearly 2 full days, sequestered in a conference room with evidence binders, photographs, transcripts, and the impossible task of reconciling a child's face with actions that spoke to something far darker than childhood. News vans lined the street outside, reporters positioned for immediate updates, the nation watching to see how this unprecedented case would conclude. Inside, every seat was filled, with dozens more watching from overflow rooms, everyone waiting for the moment that would either validate or challenge their beliefs about justice, mercy, and accountability. Evan entered the courtroom flanked by his attorneys and two deputies, wearing the same type of neat, modest clothing that had become his uniform throughout the trial. Jennifer Martinez had spent the previous evening preparing him for possible outcomes, explaining what a guilty verdict would mean, how sentencing would work, what his options might be for appeal. Evan had listened with the same detached attention he'd shown throughout, asking practical questions about prison conditions and education opportunities as if discussing a school he might attend rather than a place where he could spend decades. Martinez had felt a familiar exhaustion settle over her during that conversation. She'd represented dozens of juveniles, seen countless young people make terrible mistakes, and showed genuine remorse. But Evan remained an enigma, intellectually present but emotionally absent, capable of understanding consequences without feeling their weight. Judge Marlowe entered at precisely 9 in the morning, and the bailiff's call brought everyone to their feet. The judge surveyed the packed courtroom with his characteristic gravity, then instructed the bailiff to inquire whether the jury had reached a verdict. The moments that followed felt stretched and strange, time moving both too fast and too slow. The jury filed in, their expressions carefully neutral, none of them looking toward the defense table, a sign that Martinez recognized with sinking certainty. Jurors who'd voted to acquit or shown leniency typically looked at defendants with sympathy or reassurance. These jurors kept their eyes forward or on the judge, their faces masks of somber resolve. The foreperson, the retired teacher who'd sat in the front row throughout the trial, stood when Judge Marlowe addressed her. She confirmed they'd reached unanimous decisions on all counts. The courtroom held its collective breath as the verdict forms were passed to the bailiff, then to the judge, who reviewed them silently before returning them to be read aloud. The foreperson's voice was steady, but carried emotional weight as she began. Count 1. First-degree intentional harm resulting in the death of Martin James Rowe. The jury finds the defendant, Evan Rowe, guilty. A ripple of sound moved through the gallery. Gasps, quiet sobs, whispered acknowledgments. Caroline made a noise like something breaking inside her chest. Martinez closed her eyes briefly, her hand moving instinctively to Evan's shoulder. Count 2. First-degree intentional harm resulting in the death of Helen Marie Rowe. The jury finds the defendant, Evan Rowe, guilty. The second verdict landed with the weight of inevitability. 2 lives taken. 2 guilty verdicts. Justice, in its most fundamental form, had been rendered. But something was happening at the defense table that drew attention even in that charged moment. Evan's face, which had maintained such disturbing calm throughout the trial, had begun to change. The small smile that occasionally flickered across his features was gone. His jaw had tightened, muscles working beneath the skin as he clenched his teeth. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, suddenly gripped the edge with enough force that his knuckles turned white. For the first time since his arrest, Evan looked genuinely affected by what was happening to him. Not remorseful, that would require understanding what he'd done to others, but affected nonetheless, as if the abstract concept of consequences was finally becoming real in a way his intellectual understanding hadn't prepared him for. The smirk, that symbol of his arrogance and detachment, was fading. Judge Marlowe thanked the jury for their service and informed them that sentencing would be scheduled separately, as the law required additional evaluation and consideration given Evan's age. He explained that while they'd found Evan guilty of adult charges, sentencing would involve weighing multiple factors including his developmental status, potential for rehabilitation, and public safety concerns. The jury would not participate in sentencing. That responsibility fell to the judge alone. Several jurors nodded, some looking visibly relieved that they wouldn't have to make that final determination. Others maintained their stoic expressions, perhaps understanding that their guilty verdict had already set the trajectory, even if the specific sentence remained undecided. Judge Marlowe dismissed them with gratitude and respect, acknowledging the difficulty of what they'd been asked to do. As the jury filed out, several of them glanced once more at Evan. What they saw seemed to satisfy something. His composure was cracking, the reality penetrating whatever psychological armor he'd constructed. One juror, the construction supervisor who'd appeared angry throughout much of the testimony, gave a small nod, as if this reaction was what he'd been waiting for. The nurse who'd cried during the video evidence looked at Evan with an expression that mixed pity and sorrow, perhaps finally seeing him as the child he chronologically was, now facing the adult consequences his actions had demanded. The accountant who'd taken meticulous notes throughout simply looked away, her duty discharged, her role complete. They left the courtroom carrying the weight of a decision that would follow them for the rest of their lives, hoping they'd balance justice and mercy appropriately, knowing that some would praise them while others condemned them regardless. The courtroom slowly emptied as Judge Marlowe announced a brief recess before addressing scheduling matters. Victim advocates embraced, some crying tears of relief that at least this first step toward closure had been achieved. Media representatives rushed out to deliver breaking news updates, their voices echoing in the hallway as they reported the verdict to waiting audiences. Caroline sat motionless, staring at nothing, processing the impossible reality that her son, her child, whom she'd carried and birthed and loved, had been found guilty of ending her parents' lives. A victim advocate sat beside her, offering quiet support, not trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, simply bearing witness to grief that had no adequate expression. Caroline would later say that the verdict felt both right and unbearable, that justice for her parents meant the loss of her son, and she couldn't reconcile wanting both outcomes simultaneously. At the defense table, Martinez and Park were conferring quietly with Evan, explaining what happened next. There would be pre-sentencing investigations, psychological evaluations, opportunities to present mitigating evidence during the sentencing hearing. But Evan seemed barely to hear them. His eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he were retreating inward, trying to process information his mind couldn't fully integrate. For someone who'd spent weeks planning and executing violence with cold precision, who'd smiled in the face of accusations and shown no remorse when confronted with evidence, the reality of being held accountable appeared to be genuinely shocking. It was as if some part of him had truly believed his age would protect him, that the system wouldn't actually follow through, that his calculation about being untouchable had been correct. The guilty verdict had shattered that belief, and what remained was a 13-year-old boy beginning to understand that freedom, the thing he'd claimed to want so desperately, was something he might never experience again. Judge Marlowe returned to the bench and addressed the parties regarding next steps. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, allowing time for comprehensive evaluation and preparation of statements. He reminded everyone that despite the guilty verdicts, Evan's age remained a factor that required careful consideration under state law. He would review sentencing options ranging from juvenile facilities with potential adult transfer to blended sentences that began in juvenile settings and continued in adult facilities to sentences that reflected adult standards throughout. His decision would be guided by multiple factors: the nature and circumstances of the offense, Evan's mental state and capacity for rehabilitation, public safety concerns, and the goals of both punishment and potential redemption. His tone suggested he took this responsibility with appropriate gravity, understanding that his words in 3 weeks would determine whether Evan Rowe had any future beyond prison walls. As deputies approached to escort Evan back to the juvenile facility, he stood slowly, his movements mechanical. The change in his demeanor was striking enough that even the hardened deputies exchanged glances. This wasn't the calm, controlled boy they'd been guarding throughout the trial. This was someone beginning to crack under the weight of reality. As he was led toward the side door, Evan turned back once to look at the courtroom. His eyes found Caroline, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite remorse, but perhaps recognition. recognition that his actions had consequences not just for his grandparents, but for everyone connected to them, recognition that his mother sat broken between grief for her parents and grief for him, recognition that the freedom he'd sought had been an illusion, that removing Helen and Martin hadn't liberated him, but had instead locked him into a cage of his own making. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving only the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. The courtroom began to clear in earnest now, people processing what they'd witnessed, already forming opinions about whether the verdict was just. Some felt vindicated, believing that even children must face serious consequences for serious actions. Others felt troubled, wondering if society had failed Evan long before he failed his grandparents, questioning whether a 13-year-old could truly be beyond hope. These debates would continue in news programs and online forums, in living rooms and courthouses across the country. But for those who'd sat through every day of testimony, who'd seen every piece of evidence and heard Evan's own voice detailing his intentions, the verdict felt inevitable. Not necessarily right or wrong, those judgments were too simple for something this complex, but inevitable given what had been proven. Two people were gone. Someone had taken them deliberately, and that someone, regardless of age, had to be held accountable. The only question remaining was how severely that accountability would manifest. And in 3 weeks, Judge Marlowe would provide that answer. The 3 weeks between verdict and sentencing felt like an eternity for everyone involved. The pre-sentencing investigation was exhaustive, with social workers, psychologists, and probation officers compiling reports that would inform Judge Marlowe's decision. They interviewed Evan extensively, reviewed his complete history from birth to present, assessed his mental state and capacity for change, and evaluated what level of intervention might offer hope for rehabilitation versus what measures public safety demanded. The reports painted a troubling picture: a child whose early trauma had been compounded by instability, whose behavioral warning signs had been repeatedly missed or minimized, and whose current psychological state suggested profound deficits in empathy and moral reasoning. Yet he was still 13, an age when the brain remained plastic, when intervention theoretically could still make a difference. The question was whether society owed him that chance after what he'd done. Sentencing day arrived on a cold morning in late November, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. The courthouse was surrounded by even larger crowds than had appeared for the verdict, people holding signs expressing radically different views. Some demanded the maximum sentence allowable, arguing that anything less would diminish the value of Helen and Martin's lives and send a dangerous message about accountability. Others pleaded for mercy, holding signs that read, "Children can change," and "Rehabilitation, not revenge." Police maintained order, keeping the groups separated, ensuring that the deeply felt emotions on both sides didn't escalate into confrontation. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. The same faces that had attended throughout the trial now gathered for the final chapter of this tragic story. Evan entered wearing clothes that made him look even younger than his 13 years, a sweater that seemed too large, pants that bunched at his ankles, hair that had grown longer during his weeks in custody. Whether this was strategic styling by his defense team or simply the reality of a boy growing through one of the worst periods any child could face was unclear. What was clear was the change in his demeanor. The smirk was completely gone now, replaced by an expression that seemed caught between fear and resignation. His eyes, which had been so unsettlingly calm during the trial, now darted around the courtroom as if searching for something. An escape, perhaps, or simply understanding of what was about to happen to him. Jennifer Martinez sat beside him, her hand resting supportively on the table between them, ready to advocate one final time for the child she'd been assigned to defend. Judge Marlowe entered, and the courtroom rose as one. When everyone was reseated, the judge began by acknowledging the gravity of what they were gathered to address. He noted that this case had drawn national attention not because the crime was unique. Tragically, family violence occurred too often, but because the perpetrator's age forced society to confront difficult questions about culpability, development, and justice. He said he'd spent the past 3 weeks reviewing every piece of evidence, every expert report, every legal precedent that might guide his decision. He'd considered the arguments about brain development and childhood trauma. He'd weighed the potential for rehabilitation against the severity of the harm caused. And he'd grappled with the fundamental question of what justice demanded when someone so young committed acts so calculated and severe. The judge first addressed the victims, speaking directly to their memory and to the family members present. He described Helen and Martin Rowe as individuals who had dedicated their lives to helping others, who had opened their home and hearts to a child in need, who had embodied the kind of selfless service that held communities together. Their decision to take in their grandson despite warning signs reflected not naivety, but an almost painful optimism about human potential, a belief that love and structure could heal even deep wounds. That belief had cost them everything. Judge Marlowe's voice carried emotion as he said that their lives had value beyond measure, that their loss created a void that couldn't be filled, and that any sentence he imposed needed to reflect the permanence and severity of what had been taken from the world when they were removed from it. Then Judge Marlowe turned his attention to Evan, looking directly at the boy who sat between his attorneys. He spoke about age and development, acknowledging the defense's arguments about incomplete brain maturation and the scientific reality that 13-year-olds process decisions differently than adults. But he said that age, while relevant, couldn't be the sole consideration when the evidence showed such clear premeditation, planning, and understanding of consequences. Evan had spent weeks preparing. He had researched legal implications. He had recorded his own intentions. He had attempted to hide evidence afterward. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't understand, the judge said. These were the actions of someone who understood completely and chose to proceed anyway. Age provided context, but it didn't erase culpability when culpability was this clearly established. Judge Marlowe explained the sentencing options available under state law for a juvenile convicted of first-degree offenses in adult court. The most lenient option would be placement in a juvenile facility until age 21, with evaluation for potential release or transfer at that time. The middle option was a blended sentence, juvenile placement until age 21, followed by automatic transfer to adult prison for a specified additional term. The most severe option was essentially an adult sentence, with placement determined by age and security needs, but extending decades into the future. Each option had precedent and legal justification. Each reflected different philosophies about punishment, deterrence, and the possibility of redemption. The courtroom was absolutely silent as the judge laid out these possibilities, everyone understanding that the next words would determine whether Evan Rowe had any chance at life beyond incarceration, or whether his childhood actions would define his entire existence. The judge announced his decision with measured clarity. Evan Rowe would receive a blended juvenile-adult sentence. He would be placed in a secure juvenile facility immediately, where he would remain until his 21st birthday. During that time, he would receive educational services, psychological treatment, and regular evaluations of his progress and mental state. At age 21, he would be automatically transferred to adult prison to serve an additional 40 years, making him eligible for parole consideration at age 61. The sentence reflected both punishment and a slim possibility of eventual redemption. If Evan demonstrated genuine change during his juvenile placement, if he developed the empathy and remorse that were currently absent, he might have a life beyond prison walls someday, though that day was decades away. If he remained unchanged, he would remain confined as a danger to society. A collective sound moved through the courtroom. Gasps, quiet sobs, murmured reactions ranging from satisfaction to dismay. Victim advocates embraced, some feeling that justice had been served, others wishing the sentence had been even more severe. Child welfare advocates in attendance looked troubled, wrestling with whether this outcome represented appropriate accountability or a system giving up on a child who might still be reached. Caroline collapsed into the arms of the advocate beside her, her grief impossible to articulate. Her parents gone forever, her son effectively gone as well, lost to a system that would hold him for most of his natural life. There were no winners in this courtroom, no moment of triumph or celebration. Only the somber recognition that terrible actions demanded serious consequences and that those consequences would ripple forward through time, affecting countless lives. Judge Marlowe wasn't finished. He addressed Evan directly, his voice stern but not unkind. He said that Evan's age at the time of these offenses meant he had decades ahead of him to reflect, to grow, to potentially become someone different than who he was today. The judge said he couldn't know whether Evan possessed the capacity for genuine change, whether the empathy that was currently absent might someday develop, whether remorse might eventually penetrate the emotional walls Evan had constructed. But the sentence structure allowed for that possibility while protecting society from the very real danger Evan currently represented. Judge Marlowe said that Helen and Martin had believed in second chances, that they devoted their lives to that belief. He hoped that Evan would honor their memory by using his time in custody to become someone worthy of the faith they'd placed in him, even though they hadn't lived to see whether that faith was justified. For the first time since his arrest, Evan cried. Not the manipulative tears of someone performing emotion they didn't feel, but genuine sobs that shook his thin frame. Whether he was crying for his grandparents, for himself, or simply from the overwhelming weight of understanding that his life as he'd known it was over, no one could say. Jennifer Martinez put her arm around his shoulders, and he collapsed against her, this child who'd committed adult actions now responding with childlike despair to adult consequences. It was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, seeing someone so young break down while knowing what he'd done, feeling simultaneous pity for a child and recognition that this child had deliberately ended two lives. Judge Marlowe allowed the moment to pass without interruption, perhaps understanding that this emotional release was necessary, that Evan needed to feel something after weeks of disturbing detachment. When Evan had composed himself somewhat, still shaking but quieter, Judge Marlowe concluded the sentencing hearing. He noted that appeals were possible, and that Evan's attorneys would advise him on that process. He acknowledged the pain this case had caused throughout the community and expressed hope that healing might eventually be possible, though he recognized that for some, Helen and Martin's absence would be a wound that never fully closed. He thanked everyone for their participation in the judicial process and reminded them that while this particular case was concluding, the broader questions it raised about youth violence, family dynamics, and justice system responses would continue to challenge society. Then he brought down his gavel with a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom, a punctuation mark on a story that had captivated and horrified the nation, a final statement that even in the most difficult circumstances, the law would seek accountability. Deputies approached to escort Evan from the courtroom for the last time. He stood unsteadily, his face blotchy and wet with tears, his hands trembling as they were secured in restraints. As he was led toward the door, he turned back to look at Caroline one final time. She was watching him, her own face streaked with tears, her hand pressed against her mouth. Mother and son locked eyes for a long moment, an entire conversation passing between them without words. Apology, grief, love, loss, all compressed into a single look that would have to sustain them through years of separation. Then Evan was gone, led down the hallway toward a future measured in decades of confinement, toward facilities where he would grow from boy to man behind secure doors, toward a life irrevocably altered by 7 minutes on a Thursday evening when he'd chosen freedom over family and found himself more trapped than he'd ever imagined possible. The courtroom slowly emptied, people carrying with them questions about justice and mercy that this case had raised but not fully answered, about whether they'd witnessed appropriate accountability or a system that punished children for being broken. The only certainty was that Helen and Martin Rowe, who had believed every child deserved a chance, would never know if the child they'd tried to save might someday become someone who deserved that belief. The house on Maple Street stood empty for months after the sentencing. No one wanted to purchase a home where such tragedy had occurred, despite the family's attempts to sell it at reduced prices. Eventually, Caroline made the decision that her parents would have wanted. She donated the property to a local nonprofit that converted it into a community center focused on early intervention for at-risk youth. The rooms where Helen and Martin had lived and died were transformed into counseling spaces, classrooms, and meeting areas. The garden where Martin had spent peaceful afternoons was expanded into a memorial space with 2 benches bearing plaques that read, Helen Marie Rowe, educator, advocate, believer in second chances, and Martin James Rowe, teacher, mentor, champion of lost causes. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem what had happened there, but it was purpose found in the wreckage of senseless loss. The memorial garden became a gathering place for the community on the anniversary of Helen and Martin's passing. People who'd known them, been taught by them, been helped by them, came to share stories and plant flowers. Former students spoke about lessons learned decades ago that still guided their lives. Parents whose children had been in Helen's classes described her patience and unwavering belief that every child could learn if given the right support. Neighbors remembered Martin's kindness, his willingness to help with any project, his gentle humor, and endless optimism. These annual gatherings served multiple purposes, honoring 2 lives well lived, processing collective trauma, and recommitting to the values Helen and Martin had embodied. If they had believed in the potential for good in every person, the community reasoned, then their legacy should be continued work toward that vision, even knowing how tragically that belief had been answered. The legal impact of Evan's case extended far beyond that courtroom. Judge Marlowe's sentence became precedent cited in juvenile justice cases across the country. Legal scholars debated whether the blended sentence represented appropriate balance or uncomfortable compromise. Some argued it was a model for how the system should handle severe juvenile crimes, acknowledging developmental differences while maintaining accountability for calculated violence. Others contended it was evidence that the justice system still hadn't resolved fundamental contradictions about how to treat children who commit adult crimes. Law schools added the case to their curricula. Judges in other jurisdictions faced similar cases referenced Marlowe's reasoning in their own decisions. Evan Rowe, whether he understood it or not, had become a test case for questions that society was still struggling to answer. Inside the juvenile facility where Evan began serving his sentence, staff approached his case with a mixture of professional obligation and deep uncertainty. They'd worked with violent juveniles before, but few who'd demonstrated such clear premeditation combined with such profound empathy deficits. His treatment plan was intensive: individual therapy 3 times weekly, group sessions, educational programming designed to address moral reasoning and emotional regulation. Psychologists working with him reported slow, frustrating progress. Evan was intelligent and could intellectually discuss concepts like empathy and remorse. He could explain why his actions were wrong and what impact they'd had on others. But translating intellectual understanding into genuine emotional change proved elusive. He remained fundamentally disconnected from the suffering he'd caused, able to acknowledge it as fact without feeling its weight. 2 years into his sentence, Evan wrote a letter to Caroline. It was the first communication he'd initiated since entering custody, and its contents revealed how little had changed beneath the surface. He wrote about his daily routine, his classes, his progress in various programs. He mentioned that his therapist said he was doing well, learning appropriate skills. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added a paragraph about his grandparents. He said he understood that what he'd done was wrong and that he'd taken away people who were important to many others. The language was correct, the sentiment appropriately expressed. But it read like someone completing an assignment, checking boxes on a list of things remorseful people were supposed to say. Caroline read it once, cried for an hour, and then filed it away. She never responded. Some distances couldn't be bridged by words that carried no genuine feeling behind them. The community center established in Helen and Martin's home began offering programs that addressed the very issues their passing had highlighted: warning signs of juvenile violence, early intervention strategies for children showing concerning behaviors, support groups for families struggling with troubled youth, resources for recognizing when normal teenage rebellion crossed into something more dangerous. Mental health professionals volunteered their time, knowing that Helen and Martin's story was both unique and tragically common, caring adults who'd seen warning signs but didn't know how to interpret them, who'd offered love without the additional tools that might have made a difference. These programs couldn't undo what had happened, but they might prevent other families from experiencing similar heartbreak. It was small comfort, but it was something. Judge Marlowe gave an interview 5 years after the sentencing, reflecting on the case that had defined the latter part of his career. He said he still believed his decision had been correct, given the evidence and legal framework, but that it haunted him nonetheless. No judge wanted to send a child into a system that would hold them for decades. But the alternative, releasing someone who'd shown such calculated capacity for violence and such profound inability to feel appropriate remorse, seemed to endanger future victims. He said he hoped Evan would change, would develop the empathy that was absent at 13, would become someone different during his years of custody. But he also acknowledged uncertainty about whether such fundamental change was possible. Some cases, he said, left you with questions rather than answers, reminders that the law could establish consequences but couldn't resolve deeper mysteries about human nature and the origins of conscience. Psychological researchers began studying Evan's case as an example of juvenile conduct disorder with callous, unemotional traits. His progression from early warning signs through escalating behaviors to ultimate violence became a case study in journals and textbooks. Researchers noted opportunities for intervention that had been missed, the animal cruelty that went unpunished, the threats that were dismissed as jokes, the behavioral incidents at school that resulted in suspensions rather than psychiatric evaluation. If Evan's trajectory could teach anything, researchers argued, it was that certain patterns demanded immediate, intensive intervention rather than patience and hope for natural maturation. Not all troubled children became violent, but those displaying specific combinations of behaviors, lack of empathy, cruel actions toward vulnerable beings, escalating threats, grandiose thinking, required more than traditional parenting or standard counseling. They required specialized treatment, delivered early, before patterns hardened into something intractable. Caroline rebuilt her life slowly and painfully, carrying twin griefs that never fully reconciled. She attended therapy, joined support groups for families affected by violence, and eventually found meaning in advocacy work related to juvenile mental health services. She spoke publicly about her experiences, not to excuse Evan's actions, but to highlight how many warning signs she and her parents had missed or misinterpreted, how desperately the family had needed resources they didn't know existed or couldn't access. Her message was complex and nuanced. Children who showed concerning behaviors deserved help, but that help needed to be realistic about risk and protection of potential victims. Love wasn't enough. Hope wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed intervention that prioritized safety over family preservation, that recognized when a child's needs exceeded what any family could provide. It was a painful message delivered by someone who'd learned its truth in the most devastating way possible. As years passed, the intense media attention faded, replaced by new cases that captured public fascination. But in the community where Helen and Martin had lived and died, memory remained sharp. The memorial garden continued to bloom each spring, tended by volunteers who'd never forgotten. The community center bearing their legacy served hundreds of youth annually, some of whom might have followed troubled paths without early intervention. Former students who'd scattered across the country sent donations to support programming, attaching notes about lessons learned decades earlier that still resonated. Helen and Martin's impact hadn't ended with their lives. It had dispersed into countless other lives they'd touched, creating ripples that moved forward through time in ways they never could have anticipated. Evan turned 18 in custody, crossing the threshold from childhood to legal adulthood in a secure facility surrounded by others whose youth had been marked by violence and poor choices. He'd grown taller, his face losing some of the childish softness that had made his courtroom appearance so jarring. He participated in required programs, caused no significant behavioral problems, and accumulated enough educational credits to earn his high school equivalency. To observers, he appeared to be a success story, a troubled youth responding to structure and intervention. But those who worked with him closely remained uncertain. He said the right things, performed appropriate behaviors, and demonstrated intellectual understanding of his wrongdoing. But genuine empathy, the kind that came from truly feeling another's pain, remained elusive. He was, in the assessment of one perceptive therapist, someone who'd learned to simulate remorse without experiencing it, who understood that certain performances were rewarded but couldn't access the emotions those performances were meant to represent. 3 years remained before Evan's automatic transfer to adult prison, 3 years during which he would technically still be in juvenile custody, though his youth was effectively over. What would happen when he reached 21 remained uncertain. Would he continue demonstrating the compliant behavior that marked his juvenile incarceration? Would the adult system harden him further, or continue his slow, ambiguous progress? Would he ever genuinely feel remorse for what he'd done, or would he simply become better at pretending? These questions had no answers yet, only possibilities stretching forward through decades of confinement. And somewhere in that uncertain future, if he lived long enough and demonstrated sufficient change, there might be a hearing where he'd face parole officials and argue that he was no longer the boy who'd smiled in court while being charged with ending his grandparents' lives. Whether that argument would ever be true, only time would reveal. The final truth was that some stories didn't have satisfying endings, only stopping points where the narrative paused while life continued forward. Helen and Martin Rowe remained gone, their potential contributions to the world cut short by someone who'd valued his own perceived freedom over their irreplaceable lives. Evan remained confined, his potential future constrained by choices made when he was barely past childhood. Caroline remained caught between opposing griefs, loving and mourning both the dead and the living. The community remained marked by tragedy, but determined to build meaning from loss. And the questions the case raised about age and accountability, about warning signs and intervention, about whether some people were beyond help or simply beyond our current understanding of how to help, remained unanswered, waiting for future cases and future societies to grapple with them anew. If there was any redemption to be found, it was in the memorial garden that bloomed each spring, in the youth served by the community center, in the continued belief that even when humanity showed its darkest face, there was still value in reaching toward the light. Helen and Martin had believed that, and, though their belief had cost them everything, those who'd loved them refused to let that belief die with them. It was all that remained: memory, legacy, and the stubborn insistence that tragedy, however profound, couldn't have the final word on what their lives had meant.